Hello, everyone. Tonight, we begin a journey back in time to an era of absolute power and velvet-draped intrigue, where the throne wasn't just furniture, but fate. Imagine stepping quietly into a royal bedchamber, where candlelight flickers off silver goblets and the faint smell of incense lingers in the air. The silence isn't empty, it's holding its breath. And once you're in, you might not find your way out. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I'm doing here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a small fan for that gentle background hum, and let's begin tonight's journey together. In the stillness of a royal chamber, wrapped in stone and heavy velvet, the first rays of dawn slip through a narrow window like a secret. The fire in the hearth has quieted to a smolder, casting a drowsy glow across the room. Carved wooden panels, thick drapes, and embroidered pillows all whisper of luxury meant more for show than sleep. On the massive bed lie two figures, still in the grasp of sleep, half lost in their dreams. King Ronan, cloaked in fur and royal fatigue, stirs slightly. Queen Isabella, just 3 years older than her husband, blinks awake as the cool morning air brushes her cheek. A soft knock breaks the silence. It's the groom of the stool. Yes, that's an actual title. His job, assisting the king with the most private of morning matters. He enters without fanfare, but with the kind of solemnity that suggests he may have written poetry about chamber pots. While the king receives his ceremonial scrub and layering of robes, Isabella's own transformation begins. Her ladies-in-waiting, a swirling group of highborn women armed with silks, pins, and barely hidden rivalries, begin the process of dressing the queen. It's not dressing, it's assembly, like wrapping a holy relic in 17 layers of expensive fabric. There's no such thing as casual fashion in the royal court. Every ribbon, every stitch is calculated, each layer a symbol of power, wealth, and how many people you have to help you put on your shoes. Once adorned and composed, the royal couple makes their way to a small chapel tucked behind a corridor of stone and candlelight. The air smells of wax and prayer. A single shaft of sunlight cuts through the incense haze, landing on the cold stone where they kneel. Together, they begin the morning offices. It's all in Latin, of course. Old words repeated so often they barely register anymore. But to the watching servants, and more importantly, to the God who is believed to grant kings their crowns, this is not optional. This is divine maintenance, like rebooting your soul before breakfast. King Ronan mutters his way through the Psalms. Isabella, sharp-eyed even in devotion, remains perfectly still, her back straight, her expression serene. She knows how important this looks. Piety is politics, and politics is survival. They rise not because the prayers are done, but because time waits for no monarch. Outside that chapel, a full day awaits, filled with petitions, judgments, and whatever noble needs to explain why they accidentally started a small border war. But in this quiet moment, with sunlight painting the chapel walls and incense curling like smoke from a forgotten fire, they are not yet rulers. They are simply Ronan and Isabella, bound by crown, duty, and the quiet exhaustion that comes from knowing the world wakes only after you do. The sound of armored footsteps echoed faintly down the corridor, like a polite thunderstorm wrapped in velvet. King Ronan and Queen Isabella emerged from the chapel, their robes flowing behind them with the kind of practiced elegance that came not from comfort but repetition. To be royal was to rehearse being watched, every moment curated like a living painting. But just past the incense haze and solemn chants waited something far more demanding than prayer: daily governance. The royal court didn't sleep, it merely paused. And now it stirred. Waiting just beyond the double doors was the daily procession of advisors, scribes, heralds, and hangers-on, each ready to hurl matters of state at the king before his second cup of ale. There were messages from outlying baronies, tax grievances, land disputes, grain shortages, one sheep-related accident that somehow involved 5 families and a monk. This was monarchy by inbox. But before duty, breakfast, or at least what passed for it. The king and queen retreated to the solar, a sunlit chamber with high windows and low expectations. A modest table stood in the center, upon which lay a few plates of what someone very optimistic had labeled as the morning meal. It was not luxurious, bread so hard it could double as a weapon, cheese that had clearly won its battle against time, and a weak ale because the water wasn't trusted and wine before noon was frowned upon. Slightly. Ronan took his seat with a grunt that echoed slightly too loudly in the chamber. Isabella followed, glancing at the food with the same expression one gives to a relative's failed attempt at baking. No servants attended the table here. This meal, though simple, was private, one of the only moments in the day where the royal couple could speak without a chorus of ears eager to reinterpret every syllable into scandal. They chewed in companionable silence, the only sound the occasional crunch of defiant crust or the soft clink of pewter. Ronan wiped his mouth with a sleeve, technically inappropriate, but the embroidered napkins had vanished weeks ago, likely repurposed by a particularly bold chambermaid. "I'm meeting with the northern envoys this morning," he said between bites. Isabella nodded. "Bring extra guards, they smile too much." Ronan smirked. "Your instincts are rarely wrong." "And yet," she replied dryly, "I still married you." They both laughed, quietly, but honestly. Moments like this were rare. Their marriage, though powerful, was not always warm. Ronan had grown into his kingship like one wears a crown too large, constantly adjusting, always weighed down. Isabella, on the other hand, had been born to rule. She did not bend easily, which made them a formidable pair in council and a thoroughly exasperating one in private. After the meal, a flurry of movement signaled the next phase of the day. Attendants re-entered, straightening collars, brushing stray crumbs, and herding the royal couple toward the council chamber with the quiet desperation of those who'd once witnessed a king enter unbuttoned. The great hall awaited. Stone pillars rose like trees toward a vaulted ceiling, and long banners hung down, each embroidered with the heraldry of a kingdom now folded into Ronan's domain. At the far end sat the twin thrones, ornate, uncomfortable, and slightly tilted due to some uneven flooring no one dared fix. Ronan took his seat. Isabella did not. She preferred to stand, to walk the edge of the room like a watchful falcon. It unsettled the lords, which she liked. The chamber filled with voices. Noblemen arguing tax rates, clergy warning of drought-induced sin, merchants begging for permission to trade across borders, guarded by suspicious cousins. It was a parade of concerns wrapped in velvet and perfumed anxiety. Ronan listened. Sometimes he ruled, sometimes he deferred to Isabella, whose sharp tongue often sliced through bureaucracy better than any decree. But governing wasn't just paperwork. It was theater. Every sigh, every glance, every calculated pause was part of the performance. The crown was heavy, yes, but mostly because it came with a full script and no rehearsal time. As midday approached, the matters became more personal. A young page boy, trembling, announced the arrival of the foreign envoy from the kingdom of Nereth, a minor realm with a major appetite for drama. Entering the hall in a flourish of silks and self-importance, the ambassador bowed low enough to strain something. He came bearing a message from King Leontis, who had recently accused one of Ronan's border lords of stealing 12 barrels of honey, 3 goats, and, most offensively, a wife. The court murmured. Ronan's eyebrow rose. "I was unaware we had begun trading in spouses," he said calmly. Isabella's lips twitched. Perhaps the goat was compensation. The ambassador, already sweating, clarified that the lady in question had wandered across the border voluntarily and that her return was politely requested, with emphasis on politely, which in diplomacy meant before we send archers. A council was called. Advisors whispered. Maps were brought out. Someone spilled ink on a duchess's shoe and tried to blame a draft. It was chaos wrapped in protocol. Isabella leaned in to Ronan. "If we return her, we look weak. If we keep her, we start a war." Ronan looked tired. "Let's send her back with a better goat." 2 goats, Isabella said. "Fine." And just like that, history turned on a hoof. The hall slowly emptied, leaving behind only echoes and the faint scent of diplomatic sweat. Ronan slumped in his throne. Isabella approached, arms folded. "We've earned a break," he muttered. "You've earned a nap," she corrected. "I have letters to write." He watched her go, graceful, composed, utterly in control, and just for a moment, in the quiet aftermath of policy and pastry, King Ronan felt something unusual for a monarch of his time. Gratitude. For a queen who matched him blow for blow, word for word. For a kingdom that hadn't caught fire. Yet. And for a morning that, by royal standards, had only mildly threatened to collapse into scandal. By mid-afternoon, the castle no longer whispered. It bustled. The corridors pulsed with the sound of shifting tapestries, hurried footsteps, and the distant clang of armor trying not to trip over itself. Servants darted from chamber to chamber like overworked bees in a stone hive. Somewhere, someone dropped a silver goblet, and somewhere else, someone swore very quietly into a linen napkin. Queen Isabella didn't walk through this chaos. She navigated it the way a ship slides through a storm it doesn't fear. After a morning of council, diplomacy, and low-level border threats, she had returned briefly to her private solar, only to find 4 letters awaiting her, one embroidered glove that did not belong to her, and a greyhound asleep on her writing table. She stepped around the dog. It didn't move. Nobility came in many forms. "Is this the part of the day," she asked no one in particular, "where I respond to invitations from people who wish to flatter me with poetry and dried fruit?" Her senior handmaiden, Sorel, standing near the hearth with the quiet patience of a seasoned political operative disguised as a maid, smiled. "There's also a request from the Countess of Hatherland to discuss the upcoming solstice festival. She believes it would be wise if your majesty wore something green." Isabella blinked. "Green?" "She believes it's the color of humility and prosperity. Is that before or after she tried to poison her husband with soup?" "After, your majesty." "Ah." The queen sat, waved off the glove, and began sorting through correspondence. The first letter was from her eldest daughter, currently housed in a distant abbey for reasons that involved scandal, poor judgment, and one extremely handsome monk. She read through the delicate script, smirked once, and set it aside. The second letter came from a merchant family in the southern provinces, requesting permission to construct a fountain in her honor. Isabella appreciated the thought, but suspected it was mostly to justify an increase in taxes. Still, the flattery was well worded. She scribbled, "perhaps," in the margin, and moved on. Meanwhile, King Ronan was facing a different sort of challenge: falcons. He was in the courtyard, clad in a tunic he didn't choose, a glove he couldn't remove, and the steely glare of a bird that clearly doubted his leadership. The royal falconer, a man who'd spent more time with birds than people, offered advice that was mostly squawks and hand gestures. "Majesty," the falconer said, "you've got to become part of the bird's world." "I don't want to be part of the bird's world," Ronan replied flatly. "I want the bird to deliver a message to Duke Halbert without trying to murder my wrist." The falcon, perched like judgment itself on the king's arm, cocked its head and made a sound that could only be described as disapproval. Still, falconry was more than a royal pastime. It was spectacle, symbolism, and a subtle way to remind visiting nobles that even the king's hobbies involved sharp claws. Across the courtyard, a group of foreign dignitaries watched with polite horror as the bird attempted to take off, reconsidered, and settled for biting the leather gauntlet again. By the third attempt, Ronan had turned to one of the guards. "Tell the Duke we'll send a letter, or a pigeon, or interpretive dance." Back inside, Isabella was preparing for an entirely different confrontation. The arrival of Lady Millian, her former lady-in-waiting turned wife of a minor northern baron, was not expected or welcome. Millian had once been her closest confidant until she decided that secrets made excellent gifts, especially when given to the right courtier at the wrong time. Now, Millian stood in the reception hall, draped in velvets a little too rich for her title, eyes scanning the tapestries like she hadn't once slept on the floor of Isabella's chambers during a thunderstorm. The queen descended the staircase with the composure of a sunrise. Not fast, not hesitant, just inevitable. "Millian," she said, stopping 3 steps above. "Your Majesty," Millian curtsied, low and wide, the kind of bow you use when you want something. Isabella didn't return the pleasantry. "To what do we owe the visit?" "I wish to pay my respects," Millian said smoothly, "and to inquire about the state of the northern roadways. Trade is suffering." "You mean your trade is suffering?" "My husband's lands are." "More moss than money," Isabella finished. "Yes, I recall." Millian smiled thinly. "Surely we can speak privately." "We are." The silence that followed was short but sharp. Millian, to her credit, did not fumble. She changed tactics. "I've heard you plan to support young Lord Alric's bid for the Southern Council. Bold." "It's not bold," Isabella replied. "It's practical. He's 16. So was I." Millian blinked. "You always did love a gamble." Isabella stepped down the remaining stairs until they stood eye to eye. And you always did love to bet against me. Milian didn't flinch, but she didn't speak, either. The meeting ended without hugs, without warmth, without trust, but with perfect politeness, the kind that could slice silk. Afterward, Isabella returned to the chapel, not for prayer, but for stillness. The stained glass filtered the late light into ribbons across the cold floor. She sat on the wooden bench, not the throne-like chair reserved for royal ceremony, but the plain one at the back. It wasn't regret she felt, not guilt, just the peculiar ache of memory, the kind that arrives not with sorrow, but with a quiet, relentless weight. Back in his chambers, Ronan was finally free of the falcon. He stared at the glove like it owed him money, then poured himself a drink and dropped into a chair that had been carved by someone with no understanding of the human spine. "Falcons are traitors," he muttered. A scribe nearby paused mid-scroll. "Write that down," Ronan added. "Put it in the margins of a treaty somewhere." And thus passed another afternoon in the royal court, measured not in victories or defeats, but in exchanges, observations, and small, silent wars that would never make the history books, but shaped them all the same. The early evening hours in the royal castle brought with them a strange kind of hush. Not silence, exactly, but a softer hum, like the whole fortress had drawn a collective breath. The sun began to dip behind the western towers, casting long shadows across the stone courtyards, and the chill that always followed dusk in these thick-walled halls started to creep in. Queen Isabella changed gowns. This wasn't vanity. This was protocol. There was a difference. The fabric was darker now, richer, designed to glow under candlelight and assert power across a banquet table without her needing to say a word. The embroidery shimmered faintly as she moved, and her hair had been restyled into the sort of architectural arrangement that looked effortless only because 6 people had worked on it for 20 minutes straight. She stood by the window for a moment, watching the sun stain the horizon in gold and blood-orange streaks. Below, in the lower courtyard, the kitchen fires had been lit, and the scent of roasting meats was already winding through the corridors like a promise. Dinner in the royal household was not merely a meal. It was a production. Tonight's guests included a visiting bishop with questionable boundaries, the Duchess of Marival, who never spoke above a whisper, and Sir Cedric, a knight whose recent battlefield heroics were only slightly more impressive than his total lack of indoor volume control. In the great hall, candles had been lit in iron sconces and chandeliers, their flickering light dancing off the polished silverware and the slightly wobbly goblets that always seemed to survive one more generation of careless noblemen. Musicians tuned their lutes in the corner, servants moved like shadows, and at the high table, 2 thrones awaited. King Ronan arrived first. He looked slightly damp, not in a suspicious way, just in the manner of someone who had tried and failed to discipline his beard using rosewater and optimism. His crown sat slightly askew, and there was a faint smudge of something on his sleeve that might have once been plum sauce or ink, or possibly both. Isabella joined him moments later. Their thrones were close, but not too close. Enough for conversation, not confrontation. And as the guests filtered in, offering bows and curtsies and the occasional half-mumbled compliment, the evening officially began. The first course arrived, a roasted quail with herbs that had been grown in a royal garden and then very nearly drowned by an over-enthusiastic gardener named Ewan, who would be telling that story for the rest of his life. Sir Cedric was the first to speak, predictably. "Your Majesty," he boomed, lifting his goblet as if to toast or possibly duel it. "May your reign be long and your enemies forever confused." There was a polite ripple of laughter. Ronan smiled graciously. Isabella took a sip of watered wine and resisted the urge to glance toward the exit. The bishop leaned over and whispered something about divine right and well-marinated lamb. The Duchess nodded politely, though her face suggested she hadn't heard a word and didn't plan to. Isabella observed. She always observed. Her role at dinner was not just ceremonial, it was strategic. Every flicker of a glance, every hesitation over a bite, every too long pause between courses revealed something. Who was scheming? Who was nervous? Who was trying too hard to impress? It was a banquet, yes, but it was also a battlefield. The second course arrived, venison with honey glaze, and a side of spiced root vegetables that had been painstakingly arranged into what was either a floral pattern or a slightly confused wheel. Conversations deepened. The bishop launched into a tale about a relic recently uncovered in the southern abbey, something about a splinter of a saint's staff and the miracle of the unspilled milk. Sir Cedric loudly compared it to a time he once fell off his horse and landed on a duck, which survived. Mostly. Ronan chuckled, drained his goblet, and signaled discreetly for a refill. Isabella leaned slightly toward him. "How many goblets before you start telling stories about the siege of Wendish Hill?" "3, he replied without hesitation. 4 if I'm trying to impress someone. Please aim for 2. The king smiled. "For you, always." Dessert arrived not long after. It was a custard tart, just sweet enough and barely wobbling. Someone clapped. Probably Sir Cedric, or the tart. As the meal drew to a close, the musicians struck up a gentle tune. Not a dance yet, but the kind of melody that suggested dancing might eventually happen if enough people got sentimental or drunk. Ronan rose to offer a short speech. It was traditional, expected, mostly ignored. But tonight, he surprised them. He didn't talk about the harvest or the weather or whatever festival was allegedly around the corner. Instead, he spoke of peace. Not as a given, but as a fragile thing. A thing that required attention and patience and the willingness to choose diplomacy over fire, especially when surrounded by nobles who often thought fire sounded more exciting. He ended with a toast. "To this moment," he said, raising his goblet, "because too many times we don't realize it's peace until after it's broken." The hall quieted. Even the bishop stopped mid-nod. Glasses clinked, heads bowed, and for a brief span of heartbeats, the great hall felt less like a stage and more like a shared space, a room where people, royal or not, were simply grateful to sit, eat, and breathe without fear. Afterwards, Isabella and Ronan withdrew first. That was protocol too. But as they left the hall, her hand resting lightly on his arm, his posture straight and steady, the mood they left behind lingered. There would be more councils, more conflicts, more hidden letters and whispering courtiers, and days when the crown felt less like a blessing and more like a burden. But tonight was quiet, and in a world where power often came dressed in thunder and flame, quiet was a luxury worth its weight in gold. The moon had fully risen by the time Queen Isabella returned to her private chambers. A pale, dignified orb hanging low in the sky, it bathed the towers in silver and stretched soft blue shadows across the stone corridors. The air had turned crisp. Not cold exactly, but sharp enough to make the castle's drafty corners feel like they had opinions. Inside her chambers, a fire had already been stoked. The flames danced quietly, their orange glow wrapping around the carved wood beams and heavy velvet drapes like an old friend returning from a long absence. It smelled faintly of cedar and something floral, possibly lavender, possibly an ambitious mouse with a taste for soap. Isabella sat at her writing table. It was a large, lacquered thing, older than her marriage and sturdier than most noble alliances. Here she kept the letters that mattered, the ones no servant ever saw. Here were notes from foreign queens, warnings in cipher, and a small folded square of parchment that had once started a rebellion and ended a bishop's career. Tonight, she was not reading. She was thinking. The dinner had gone well. Too well. That was always suspicious. She didn't trust silence, especially not the kind that came after a toast about peace. There was a pattern to these things, calm, quiet, then sudden chaos. The crown did not protect one from storms. Often, it acted like a lightning rod. A knock at the chamber door broke her thoughts. It was Sorel, her handmaiden, carrying a small tray, warm milk, 2 dates, and a folded note. Isabella raised an eyebrow. "Who writes to me after dessert?" Sorel didn't answer. She never speculated aloud. That was one of the reasons Isabella trusted her. The note, sealed with pale green wax, bore the insignia of House Marival. Ah, the Duchess. The one who whispered instead of speaking and never smiled unless someone else cried first. The message was short, a request, a quiet one. She wished to meet privately the next morning. No advisors, no witnesses, just the 2 of them in the Eastern Gardens. Isabella sipped the milk, chewed the dates, and stared at the fire. She did not smile, but she did nod, very slightly, as though confirming something only the flames would understand. Meanwhile, in a wing of the castle far less scented and significantly louder, King Ronan was locked in a fierce battle with his boots. He had removed one easily enough. The second, however, was clinging to his foot with the determination of a drunken badger. He considered calling for help, then considered that he was king and had survived 3 assassination attempts, 2 sieges, and 1 awkward poetry recital. He would not be bested by leather. After some extremely unroyal contorting and at least 1 muffled curse, the boot surrendered. He leaned back on the edge of the bed, now gloriously barefoot, and allowed himself a moment of nothing. No questions, no speeches, no birds. The chamber was quiet, save for the occasional creak of old beams and the faint snore of his dog, Bristle, curled up on a discarded cloak. Ronan reached for the goblet on the side table, found it empty, and decided he was too tired to care. Then came the knock. Not loud, not insistent, but unmistakably out of hours. He opened the door himself. It was Lord Halden, his master of whisperers, a man who spoke rarely and never without reason. His eyes were sharp, his hair graying at the temples, and he smelled faintly of parchment and secrets. "Forgive the hour, Majesty," Halden said, "but I believe it unwise to wait." That sentence was rarely followed by anything enjoyable. Ronan gestured him inside. Halden handed him a folded scrap of parchment. No seal, just a name written in a shaky hand, Ulrich. Ronan frowned. "The boy went missing from his chambers 3 hours. He's 16, probably chasing a chambermaid. He left through the servants' passage, armed, with a map. That was less romantic. Does Isabella know?" "Not yet. She will," Ronan muttered. "She always does." Halden nodded once. "There's more." "Of course there was. We believe he may be headed to the borderlands. He's been writing letters to his cousin there about raising banners." Ronan closed his eyes, not out of exhaustion, but calculation. Ulrich was young, ambitious, the kind of noble youth who read too many heroic ballads and mistook poetry for policy. He had also recently been denied a seat at the Southern Council. Isabella's decision, technically, though it had been a joint one. Ulrich hadn't taken it well. If the boys stirred rebellion in the wrong corner, it wouldn't be a rebellion. It would be a mess, a preventable, embarrassing, entirely teenage mess. "Send riders," Ronan said, "not soldiers. I want him found, not scared into running farther." "Yes, Majesty." And Halden, "No word of this reaches the court." "Of course." After Halden left, Ronan stood in the center of the room for a long time. It was always the young ones. He wasn't angry, not yet. He remembered being 16, remembered thinking he could shape kingdoms with charisma and the right sword. It hadn't worked then, either. Across the castle, Isabella lay in bed but did not sleep. She never slept deeply on nights that felt too smooth. Tonight had been smooth as silk, and she knew silk could suffocate just as easily as it could impress. Something was brewing, not war, not yet, but motion. And in her experience, motion came from people like Ulrich. She would deal with it in the morning. In the garden with the Duchess, and maybe a knife tucked somewhere, just in case the conversation turned nostalgic. Lord Ulrich had never slept outdoors before. Not truly. He had once fallen asleep in the castle orchard after a particularly exhausting game of duck and duel, which involved more pride than rules and ended with a bruised shin and a lecture about conduct befitting future nobility. But this was different. Now he lay beneath a canopy of stars, the cold earth pressing against his spine through layers of wool and regret. His horse, tethered loosely to a nearby tree, shifted and snorted softly in the dark. The fire he'd built earlier was nothing more than a few glowing embers now, flickering against the night like the last sparks of confidence he wasn't entirely sure he ever earned. He wasn't lost, exactly, but he was no longer sure where the road he'd chosen would end. That was the problem with grand gestures. They echoed louder in one's head than they did in reality. In the morning, he would ride north to Balamir. He had a plan, or at least the outline of one. He would find allies, stir discontent, and prove to the crown that he was more than ornamental nobility, that he deserved a seat, a voice, a future crafted by his own hand. But the night was long, and he was starting to understand just how far away the castle truly was. Back within those walls, Queen Isabella was already at her desk. She had not slept. She rarely did when variables went walking into the dark. The Duchess of Marival had, to her reluctant credit, delivered a name, Baron Edron of Balamir, a lesser noble, once loyal to the crown. Recently, not. He'd been corresponding with Ulrich, quietly, consistently, and now, evidently, successfully. Isabella had ordered a rider to intercept the Baron before Ulrich could reach him. Not to arrest him. Not yet. Just to remind him that she noticed things and remembered everything. She penned 2 letters. The first was to the High Council, confirming their upcoming session and subtly reinforcing that succession was not up for debate. The second was to her eldest daughter, locked away in a convent and not, as rumor occasionally suggested, in a romantic fog with a monk named Aurelius. The letter was sharp, precise, and in its own way, comforting. Because family, even when fractious, was still the battlefield worth writing home about. King Ronan, for his part, was not writing anything. He was in the armory. Not for war, at least not immediately, but because he found clarity among cold steel and honest tools. The master-at-arms, a grizzled man named Brannick who spoke mostly in shrugs, was watching the king examine a long, slightly curved blade once gifted by a southern prince with more ego than land. "Too flashy," Ronan said, handing it back. Brannick grunted. "That was the point, your majesty." Ronan smiled thinly. "I need something practical." Brannick handed him a plain longsword. No jewels, no etching, just well-balanced iron worn smooth by use. Ronan gripped the hilt. "Better." "You expecting to use it?" The king didn't answer. That night, as the moon slid westward and the stars turned like gears in an ancient clock, a rider galloped through the pine woods just beyond Balamir. Cloaked, fast and quiet. She carried a message not for the Baron, but for the man watching him. Lord Thorn, tall, scarred, and too clever by half. Read the note by the light of a shuttered lantern, his breath fogging in the cold. He read it once, then again, then burned it as instructed. To Ronan's credit, the message was not a command. It was a warning. If Ulrich crossed a line, rallied troops, declared a cause, he was to be stopped, discreetly but firmly. The boy must return. Alive, ideally unbroken, but returned. Thorn sighed, turned to his second-in-command, and said the most cursed phrase in royal service. "Fetch the cloak. We're going riding." By the following afternoon, Ulrich reached the outskirts of Balamir. It wasn't a city. Not really. It was a gathering of opportunism. Stone buildings slouched against hills, wooden huts leaning into alleys like they were whispering gossip. There were banners, but none matched. Fires burned in the open, and every face that turned to him as he rode through looked like it knew secrets it wouldn't tell for free. Baron Edran greeted him at the old watchtower. Edran was tall, broad-shouldered, with a beard that did most of the speaking. He smiled too easily and bowed too low. "Your lordship," he said. "What an honor." Ulrich dismounted with what he hoped was confidence and not exhaustion. "Thank you for receiving me," he said, echoing a phrase he'd heard nobles use when pretending to like each other. Edran waved it off. "You're not here to flatter. You're here because you're ready to be taken seriously." Ulrich nodded. "I am." Edran gestured him inside. "Then let's make that happen." Inside the tower, maps had been pinned to the walls. Not parchment, but cloth, portable, concealable, and marked with names that hadn't appeared on official records in years. Names of lords who had not sworn loyalty. Names of old allies with new grudges. Names of opportunity. Ulrich felt a rush. This was what he'd imagined. Strategy. Rebellion. Legacy. "We're not calling it a revolt," Edran said. "We're calling it a rebalancing." "Smart," Ulrich replied. "Words matter." "They do, especially to the queen." Ulrich tried to smile. It came out as a grimace. That night, over a meal of bread and meat so tough it might have once been shield leather, Edran leaned in. "Are you ready for what this means, Lord Ulrich?" Ulrich didn't hesitate. "Yes," he lied, and the stars above Balamir watched silently as they always did, blinking slowly like gods too tired to intervene. The eastern gardens of the castle were quiet before dawn. Not silent. Nothing in a castle was ever truly silent, but quiet in that sacred pre-sunrise way. Birds had not yet decided to sing. Servants, still yawning, moved like ghosts in the courtyards, and the fog, soft as breath, clung to the hedgerows like it too, hadn't yet decided whether to rise. Queen Isabella arrived early. She always did. Wrapped in a deep green cloak, lined with sable and trimmed with purpose, she moved with the kind of calm one earns only after years of knowing exactly where to place one's feet, and whom to crush under them. The garden, while ornamental, was far from natural. Every path, every hedge, every blooming vine had been engineered to appear like nature had simply chosen to cooperate. It hadn't. This was a place of design, of precision, which made it the perfect location for delicate conversations. The Duchess of Marival was already waiting. She stood near a stone bench, posture immaculate, gloved hands folded lightly in front of her. Her expression, as always, hovered somewhere between polite curiosity and mild disdain. "Your Majesty," she said with a small bow. "Duchess," Isabella replied. "You asked for a private meeting. You have it." The Duchess hesitated just a moment, enough to be noticeable. Then she smiled, a slight twitch at the corner of her mouth, like her face wasn't used to the motion. "There is unrest in the north," she began. "Whispers, not yet rebellion, but questions." Isabella arched a brow. Questions about what? About succession, about strength, about how decisions are made, who is favored. It was a carefully constructed sentence, deliberately vague, wrapped in courtesy but sharp at the edges. "Let me guess," Isabella said. "These questions are being asked by young men with too much ambition and not enough patience." The Duchess gave a non-committal shrug. "They ask what any loyal subject would ask?" "No," Isabella replied, stepping closer. "They ask what traitors ask when they think they're being clever." The fog began to lift. The sun, low and pale, spilled over the stone walls and onto the ivy-covered trellises. Light crept along the path, casting both women in golden shadow. "You speak plainly," the Duchess said, her voice thin. "I don't have time for metaphor," Isabella said. "I have a kingdom to hold." A pause. Then, "Lord Ulrich has left the castle." The Duchess blinked. For the first time, something flickered behind her eyes, concern or calculation. "I assume you know where he's gone," Isabella said. "If not, someone close to you does." "I had heard rumors." "Then consider this your chance to be useful." The wind shifted, stirring the leaves. A few petals fell from the arbor overhead and landed at their feet like spilled secrets. "Why come to me?" the Duchess asked. "Because I believe you still know the difference between loyalty and opportunism," Isabella replied. "And because I think you'd rather stand beside the throne than kneel before a fool who thinks he can take it." It was not a threat. It was a fact. And the Duchess, to her credit, understood facts. "I'll make inquiries," she said. "You'll do more than that," Isabella said. "You'll find him." The Queen turned to leave, then stopped. "Oh," she added without looking back, "and if you're lying to me, if you already knew where he was, I suggest you pray he returns safely, because I am far more dangerous to deal with when I'm disappointed." By the time Isabella returned to the inner keep, the court had begun to stir. News moved fast in castles, faster than light, faster than horses. If someone dropped a goblet in the west wing, the east wing would know before it hit the ground. So it was no surprise that whispers of Ulrich's disappearance had already begun to ripple through the halls. Some said he'd been kidnapped. Others said he'd eloped. One particularly enthusiastic scullery maid claimed he'd joined a monastery to repent for gambling, though she could not produce evidence that he had ever gambled. King Ronan, by contrast, was speaking to no one. He sat in his private chamber, poring over a map with Lord Haldan and two riders freshly returned from the northern roads. Their boots were muddy, their faces grim. "He passed through the Red Pine Gate just before midnight," the first rider reported. "Alone, took the East Fork toward Balamir." "That leads straight into the borderlands," Haldan said. Ronan frowned. "Any sign of companions?" The second rider shook his head. "Only his horse, and a satchel." "What was in the satchel?" "Couldn't say, Majesty, but he seemed prepared." Ronan muttered something impolite. Balamir was a dangerous place for a prince, dangerous for anyone, really. It was where laws went to nap and bandits went to church. If Ulrich had truly gone there, he wasn't just sulking. He was scheming. The king rose. "Send word to Lord Commander Thorn, quietly. I want eyes on every road in and out of Balamir. No banners, no swords drawn unless necessary." "And if we find him?" Haldan asked. Ronan looked out the window. The sky was clear, birds wheeling lazily overhead. It was going to be a beautiful day. "If we find him," the king said, "we remind him that ambition is only dangerous when paired with ignorance." And far away, beyond the forests and farmlands and watchful towers, a teenage boy on horseback paused at the edge of a ravine. Lord Ulrich, heir of a dozen old promises and the center of a dozen new ones, pulled his cloak tighter and studied the road ahead. It was wild country now. Not ruled, not tamed, which was exactly what he wanted. He wasn't running, he told himself. He was proving something. To the court, to the crown, to the queen who never saw him as more than a boy, and perhaps, just perhaps, to himself. Morning came to Balamir like a drunk returning home. loud, clumsy, and not entirely welcome. Ulrich awoke on a thin mattress stuffed with straw and something vaguely alive. His back ached, his limbs protested. His pride, however, was intact, albeit slightly bruised by the memory of last night's supper and Baron Edran's unnerving habit of whispering even when no one was around. The tower was colder than expected. Outside, frost clung to the edges of cracked shutters. Inside, a single candle flickered stubbornly beside a half-empty goblet and a map still open to the borderlands. Ulrich dressed quickly, donning his cloak and the new tunic Edran had provided, black with silver trim, stitched to suggest leadership. It was a small detail, but details mattered, especially to people looking for symbols. And right now, Ulrich needed to be a symbol more than a boy. Downstairs, Edran was already waiting. He had that irritating look of someone who either didn't sleep or didn't admit to it. He gestured toward the door. "Today we ride." Ulrich nodded, adjusting his belt and trying not to look as uncertain as he felt. "Where to?" "A gathering. Not large, but important. Nobles, hedge knights, free lords, people who want to hear what you have to say. And if they don't, then you say it better." Outside, their horses were ready. Ulrich's mount, a tall, dappled gelding with a temper, snorted as he approached. The boy whispered something to it. A promise, maybe, or a plea. They rode northeast. The journey was short but tense. Every village they passed eyed them with suspicion. Some offered waves, others shut doors. The land here did not trust royalty, even runaway ones with better cloaks than plans. By midday, they reached the old mill. It had once belonged to a miner family who'd been generous with grain and terrible with debt. Now it stood as a meeting hall, its giant wheel creaking slowly as if sighing at its new job. Inside, a dozen figures gathered around makeshift benches and overturned barrels. They wore no crowns, no banners flew, but the room buzzed with expectation. Edran stepped aside. "This is him," he said. No one clapped. One man coughed. Ulrich cleared his throat and walked forward. His heart thudded like a war drum in a quiet forest. He'd rehearsed this. Not the words, he didn't have a speech, but the presence. Shoulders back, chin up, speak like someone who expected to be heard. "My name is Lord Ulrich," he began, "son of House Marinth, heir to nothing but capable of everything." Silence. Then a gruff voice from the back. "Then why are you here?" Ulrich nodded. "Fair. Because I believe the crown no longer listens," he said. "Because decisions are made in rooms I'm not allowed in, and because this kingdom deserves more than a single voice echoing through polished halls." Someone shifted. Another leaned forward. "I don't offer you war," he said. "I offer you relevance. I offer you change." A pause. Then Edran clapped. Once. Slowly. The room followed, not enthusiastically, but enough. It wasn't a victory, it was a beginning. Back in the capital, Queen Isabella stood on the balcony of her solar, watching birds wheel above the east towers. Her informant had returned just after dawn, breathless and dust-covered, with a full report. Ulrich was indeed in Balamur. He was speaking to minor lords. He was not yet raising banners. Yet. Isabella did not rage. She did not shout. She simply turned to Sorel and said, "Prepare a summons for Baron Edran, and make sure it's written on parchment that burns slowly. I want him to feel every word." Ronan, when informed, sighed deeply and muttered something about teenage crusades and a perfectly good falcon going to waste. But he didn't object, not openly, because he knew what Isabella knew. This was no longer a matter of rebellion. It was a test of the court, of the crown, of their ability to act before history wrote them out. By nightfall, Edran returned with Ulrich to the tower. They'd spoken with 6 lords, 3 were interested. 1 was enthusiastic, 2 said nothing and smiled too much. "We're gaining momentum," Edran said. Ulrich wasn't sure. It felt more like gravity. He stood at the window, staring into the dark beyond the hills. "Do you think they'll come for me?" he asked. Edran shrugged. "If they do, we'll be ready." "You sound confident." "I'm not, but I know how to act like I am." Ulrich nodded slowly. "Good," he said. "Teach me." And in that moment, under the flickering candlelight of a borrowed stronghold, a prince began to understand something dangerous. That power was not taken all at once. It was gathered, piece by piece, promise by promise, word by word. Back in the capital, the mood was shifting. The castle no longer buzzed with idle gossip. It crackled. The nobles, ever attuned to the scent of change and potential chaos, had begun to cluster in quiet corners. Their conversations were lower, their glances sharper, and their courtesies just a little too sweet. No one said it outright. But the question hung in the air like the scent of an overripe peach. What is Lord Ulrich doing? And more dangerously, should we be doing it too? Queen Isabella noticed, of course. She always did. For every lord who greeted her with polished smiles and formal bows, she took mental notes. How long the bow lasted, how quickly they averted their gaze, how few questions they asked about the king's health. The court was beginning to pivot, and pivoting, Isabella knew, could become toppling if one wasn't careful. She summoned the High Chancellor, an elderly man named Varick who'd served 3 kings, 7 wars, and once survived an assassination attempt by hiding in a wine barrel. He now moved slower, spoke softer, and only trusted furniture that didn't wobble. Ulrich is gaining sympathy, she said, pacing across the solar. He's gaining attention, Varick replied. Not the same thing. It becomes the same thing if people believe he acts with legitimacy. Varick adjusted his spectacles. Then strip it from him. Isabella stopped pacing. No, she said. We strip the stage instead. The plan, when it came together, was simple, elegant even. Not to confront Ulrich, but to crowd him, to summon the very nobles he sought and bring them back into the fold, publicly, respectfully, and with enough gold to remind them where power truly lay. They want to be heard, Isabella said, so we listen. Loudly. She drafted invitations, not demands, invitations, each one sealed with the royal crest, each worded with just enough warmth to flatter, and just enough steel to suggest refusal was inadvisable. Meanwhile, King Ronan had taken a more personal route. He was in the royal stables, brushing down his horse, a task usually left to squires, but one he insisted on doing when thinking. The beast, a mottled warhorse named Ironpost, was too old for battle, but too proud to retire, much like Ronan himself. Boy wants to prove himself, he said aloud. They all do, at that age. The stablemaster nodded but said nothing. Talking during royal soliloquies was not advised. I did the same once, Ronan continued. Stormed out, rode into some godforsaken province with a half-formed army and a dream, got dysentery and a dagger in the leg. He paused. Learned a lot, though. Back in Balamir, Ulrich was learning too, just differently. The day had started with enthusiasm. A courier arrived with a message from Lord Fenric, who pledged his quiet support and promised to remain available should circumstances change in a favorable direction, which, translated, meant, if this gets real, I might be on your side. Edron seemed pleased. This is how it builds, he said. First whispers, then pledges, then banners. Ulrich nodded. He was beginning to understand the pattern. But by afternoon, cracks had begun to form. A meeting with Lady Vera, a minor noble who controlled a strategically placed bridge and an army of precisely 9 men, went badly. She arrived late, brought her own wine, and spent most of the conversation asking whether Ulrich intended to seek divine favor or simply rely on his hair. Edran tried to recover. Ulrich smiled politely, but when she left, she took the wine and left behind nothing but doubt. We need someone bigger, Ulrich said. A name. Edran tapped the table. I've sent word to Lord Hendril. That old snake? Exactly. Everyone watches what Hendril does. If he speaks for you, half the Midlands might follow. And if he doesn't, then we'll adjust. Adjust. Ulrich was beginning to hate that word. That night, he stood alone on the tower balcony, watching torches flicker along the distant hills. The stars were hidden behind clouds, and the moon, thin and unimpressed, hung like a coin dropped into a deep well. He missed home, not the comfort, not the soft beds or warm meals. He missed certainty. In the castle, you knew your place. You might hate it, you might fight it, but it was there, carved into stone, written into every corridor and creaking step. Here, everything was choice and consequence. In the silence, he heard footsteps. Baron Edran joined him, holding 2 cups of something steaming and vaguely herbal. Sleep eludes you? Ulrich took a cup, sipped, winced. What is this? Boiled roots, good for clarity. Tastes like betrayal. Some truths do. They stood for a moment. Then Ulrich asked quietly, if this fails, if I ride back into that castle empty-handed, what happens? Edran didn't answer right away. Then you become a cautionary tale. And if it works, you become a future. Neither option sounded comforting, but Ulrich nodded, and in the distance, beneath the clouds, the first flakes of snow began to fall. Winter was early, and with it came the tightening of choices. Snow had not been invited, but it arrived anyway, soft, insistent, and in quantities that made everyone nervous in ways they didn't admit aloud. In Balamere, the roads became mud under frost, and the air tasted like iron and wet stone. The town's usual rhythm, bartering, gossiping, quietly stabbing, slowed as coats were pulled tighter and fires were lit earlier. It was the kind of snow that didn't just fall, it loitered. Ulrich sat beside the hearth in the main hall of the tower, as wrapped in a fur cloak that smelled faintly of someone else's horse. Across from him, Baron Edron was reading yet another letter, his mouth twisted in what might have been concentration or mild indigestion. "They're stalling," Edron muttered. "Who?" "Everyone." The latest reply from Lord Hendrell had arrived that morning via a courier, who looked like he'd walked through 6 miles of bad decisions. The message had been diplomatic, which in noble terms meant it said absolutely nothing in the most flattering possible way. Ulrich frowned. He's waiting to see who blinks first. Correct. Ulrich stood and paced. If we do nothing, we look weak. If we push too hard, we look desperate. Also correct. He stopped pacing. We need leverage. Edron set the letter down. You need spectacle. Ulrich blinked. What do you mean? Words are wind, Edron said, and even wind can be ignored. But spectacle demands attention. You want the lords to choose your side? Make your side the one they can't ignore. The boy considered this. You want a performance? No, Edron said. I want a moment. He leaned forward. Tomorrow we ride to High Bridge. There's a gathering there, traders, pilgrims, small folk. Not nobles, not yet, but people, and people talk. And what exactly do we do? You make a speech, you show your face, you become more than a rumor. Ulrich hesitated. And if the crown hears about it? They already have. In the capital, Queen Isabella stared out her tower window at the snow swirling through the courtyard like a flock of startled birds. They're moving toward High Bridge, Sorel reported, holding a dispatch fresh from the ink. Isabella nodded. They'll expect a reaction, she said. Sorel remained still. What sort? A show of force would validate him. Silence would embolden him. The Queen turned. Send food. Sorel blinked. Pardon? Send carts of grain to High Bridge with banners. Let the people see where warmth and bread come from. And Ulrich? Let him give speeches to the cold. The following day, High Bridge was louder than usual. Snow creaked beneath cartwheels and boots, and the air buzzed with chatter. Merchants wrapped in layers hawked winter spices. Children chased chickens. Dog barked at everything. The bridge itself, old and wide, connected the two halves of the valley, and now connected something else too. At the center of the commotion, Lord Ulrich rode in. Not like a prince, like a man with something to prove. He wore black and silver, his cloak fluttering in the wind like it had somewhere better to be. People paused. Not bowed, not cheered, but paused. And that was enough. Edron raised a hand. My lords and ladies, he called, generously applying those titles to a crowd mostly consisting of farmers and traveling cheese vendors, I present to you Lord Ulrich, voice of the future. Ulrich stepped forward. He hadn't prepared a speech. He hadn't needed to. He knew what they expected. Some of you know my name, he began. Some don't. That's fair. I've lived behind walls. I've sat at tables where food never ran out. I've worn silk while others wore snow. The crowd murmured. Some nodded. I came here not to boast, but to listen, to understand what the kingdom forgets. He raised his voice. I am not your ruler. Not yet, but I could be your ally, and I promise you this. If I ever wear a crown, it will not sit so high that I forget who bled to build the throne. It was well delivered, earnest, rehearsed only in pain. The crowd clapped, some even cheered, and behind them, unnoticed at first, came the grain carts. 4 wagons, each bearing the royal crest. Drivers shouted about fresh wheat, dried meats, warm cloaks, free, from the crown. Ulrich froze. Edron cursed under his breath. The crowd turned. They cheered again, but not for him. The Queen had spoken, without saying a word, and the spectacle, it now belonged to her. That evening, in the tower at Balamere, Ulrich stood at the window again. This time, he wasn't watching the stars like he was watching a boy learn how quickly attention shifts when bellies rumble. She outplayed me, he admitted. Edron didn't deny it. She played first. Ulrich sat down heavily. What now? We find a new audience, Edron said. One she can't feed. But Ulrich's eyes were tired, and for the first time, doubt curled at the edge of his certainty, because power wasn't just about speaking well, it was about timing. And Isabella's timing had been perfect. The storm came 3 days later. Not a metaphorical storm, though those were certainly brewing, but a real, teeth-chattering, window-rattling tempest that screamed across the countryside like it had a personal grudge against roofs. Snow turned to ice, roads vanished beneath white silence, travel ceased, messengers disappeared, and the entire kingdom felt for a moment like it had paused mid-breath. In Balamere, the tower groaned with the weight of wind. Ulrich stood by the hearth, wrapped in a blanket that had definitely once belonged to a better man. His boots steamed faintly, his hair was damp, and his mood could best be described as philosophically frozen. "I'm beginning to understand why monarchs stay indoors," he muttered. Across the room, Edran sat hunched over a table with a map pinned down by tankards. He looked up, grim. "We've lost contact with 2 scouts, one headed west, the other south." Ulrich frowned. "Are we assuming natural causes or royal intervention?" "Yes," Edran replied without looking up. They were stuck. Not just physically, though the snowdrifts outside were tall enough to lose a mediocre noble in. Politically, they'd hit a wall too. The failed spectacle at High Bridge had dulled momentum. Isabella's generosity had undercut their narrative. And now, silence. No new letters, no new pledges, only the sound of wind and the slow creak of ambition cooling in winter air. "I need to do something," Ulrich said. "Anything." Edran didn't answer, which, from him, meant agreement. So that night, they gathered what few followers remained. 8, maybe 9, depending on whether you counted the archer with a chronic leg injury and a flexible sense of loyalty. They met in the lower hall, cloaks soaked, eyes sharp. "We're not beaten," Ulrich said. "We're just paused." It wasn't a great speech, but in the stillness, it felt like something. And in the capital, Queen Isabella was also watching the storm. Her window panes had frosted over, delicate ice patterns forming strange, sprawling kingdoms of their own. Sorel stood by the fire, pouring tea that steamed like breath in the cold. "The roads are impassable," she said. "Even the ravens aren't flying." Isabella sipped her tea. "Good, let the snow carry the weight of inaction for once." She wasn't concerned. Not yet. The storm was doing what diplomacy couldn't, stalling without accusation. Still, she knew better than to trust nature's loyalty. People made plans in the snow, and fools mistook stillness for surrender. She turned to her desk and unrolled a letter she'd kept hidden under a pile of state documents. It bore no seal, just a line of elegant script. "We can resolve this, but only if you're the one who calls." It wasn't from Ulrich, but it was about him, and that made it dangerous. 2 days later, the snow began to melt, not enough to free the roads, but enough to send rivulets of cold water down tower walls and into boots that hadn't planned for seasonal betrayal. Ulrich stood on the battlements, squinting at the southern pass. The sky was gray and sulking, but beneath the clouds, movement, a rider, alone, armored, and bearing the Queen's banner. They met him in the courtyard. The man was tall, grim, and definitely not here to flirt. He dismounted, handed over a scroll, and said, "From Her Majesty. Read carefully." Then he left. Not even a drink, just frostbite and formality. Ulrich broke the seal. He read it once. Then again, then sat down slowly on a half-frozen crate. Edran looked over his shoulder. "Well," he said, "she's clever." Because the letter wasn't a threat, it was an invitation to return, to speak, to be heard, properly this time in the royal court. It was a trap, obviously, but it was also a door. And Ulrich, despite everything, wanted that door to open. "She's offering a council seat," Ulrich said softly, "under review." Edran was silent. Then, "If you go back, they'll make you a symbol." Ulrich stood. "I already am." They stared at each other. Finally, Edran nodded. "But we ride armed, and we ride slow, and we leave routes open." Agreed. When word of Ulrich's return reached the court, the effect was immediate. Nobles straightened, advisors whispered, and Isabella smiled. Not wide, but with intent. "He's learning," she said. Ronan, beside her, raised an eyebrow. "Is this a reconciliation or an ambush?" "Both," she said. "Hopefully." Ulrich arrived at the capital under a sky that couldn't decide if it was raining or apologizing. He entered the city through the southern gate, public, crowded, and perfect for being seen. People watched, some bowed, most didn't. He kept his head high. The throne room was prepared, polished, and colder than memory allowed. Isabella stood at the far end, cloaked in black with a crown that seemed heavier today. She didn't step forward. He did. They stood 3 paces apart. He bowed deeply. She said, "Rise." He did, and waited. "You left," she said. "You weren't listening." "I was. I just wasn't agreeing." "Then maybe now we do both." Silence. Then, we'll see. The council chamber was colder than Ulrich remembered. Not by temperature necessarily, but by tone. The walls, lined with tapestries of old battles and older men, seemed less like decoration and more like silent witnesses. Watching, waiting, judging. Queen Isabella had summoned only the inner circle for this session. 12 chairs, 11 occupants, and one empty seat, placed deliberately. Not at the end, where deference lived, and not at the center, where power rested, but just off to the side. It was not a seat of command. It was a seat of consideration. Ulrich took it without a word. The High Chancellor cleared his throat. This meeting is now in session. No applause, no ceremony, just an air of held breath. Isabella was first to speak. Lord Ulrich has returned at my invitation. He sits today not as a traitor nor as a usurper, but as a voice worth hearing. That was her opening move, legitimacy without surrender. She turned to Ulrich. You claim the crown no longer listens. We are listening now. Ulrich, surrounded by senior nobles who had known him as a child and ignored him just as long, felt the heat rise in his collar. But he met their gazes one by one. I left, he said, because I believed I had no voice. Murmurs. I return because I believe I still have something to say. He paused. You speak of loyalty, so do I. But I ask, loyalty to what? To bloodlines? To titles? Or to the people who bleed under them? That got their attention. The Duke of Heron shifted uncomfortably. The Countess of Vel stood straighter. You know the borders are restless, Ulrich continued. You know the smaller lords feel forgotten. I went to listen. What I heard wasn't treason, it was exhaustion. He sat back. If we don't give them something new, they'll take something old. The chamber fell quiet. Even Isabella did not interrupt. Then the High Chancellor, slow as ever, asked, And what do you propose? Ulrich looked at Isabella, then at the room. Representation, he said. Not just nobles, voice for the provinces, trade, faith, common defense, a council that reflects the kingdom, not just its titles. It was bold, it was dangerous, and it was, at least to some, very, very appealing. Not everyone agreed, of course. The Duke of Heron nearly choked on his pride. This is chaos, he spat. We are the stewards of order. You are the stewards of stagnation, Ulrich shot back. And you're not even good at that. Gasps, a few smiles. Isabella raised a hand. Enough. She turned to the Chancellor. Put it to review. Not a vote, not yet. Let the other councils read it. Let them stew. The Chancellor nodded, ink already scratching parchment. And just like that, Ulrich's idea, impossible only days ago, was now a possibility on official record. Later that night, Ulrich found himself walking the southern battlements alone, or nearly alone. Isabella joined him, her cloak billowing slightly in the cold breeze. You did well, she said. Not everyone thinks so. Not everyone matters. They paused by a parapet. I know what this looks like, she said. To some, it seems I've allowed a challenge. To others, that I've shown weakness. And to you, he asked. She looked at him, really looked. To me, it means I won. Ulrich raised a brow. I brought you back, she said. Alive, speaking, learning. She leaned closer, and I did it without a sword. He smiled, slightly. You always preferred knives in conversation. Quieter, she said. They stood in silence for a while, the city lights flickering below like stars trapped in stone. I won't stop pushing, Ulrich said. I wouldn't respect you if you did. And if I ever cross the line? She turned, and her voice was calm as ever. Then I'll remind you where it is. In the weeks that followed, the capital shifted. Not dramatically, but like a ship adjusting to a new wind. Ulrich remained in the castle, officially consulting, unofficially stirring. He was given quarters, guards, and a desk piled with documents older than he was. He met with traders, priests, younger nobles eager for change, and older ones too tired to fight it anymore. Some began to call him the Listening Lord. He didn't love it, but he understood it. Baron Edron returned to Balamir, quietly. His role now was to manage, to watch, and to report. And should things falter, to be the plan that nobody talked about out loud. Queen Isabella continued her reign, steady, sharp, and always one step ahead. She did not reject Ulrich's ideas, nor did she endorse them. She let them circulate, let them simmer, let them become necessary on their own. And when messengers came from distant lords, first cautious, then curious, then convinced, she simply folded their letters and said, yes, I was just about to propose that. One evening, months after his return, Ulrich sat with Ronan in the royal gardens. The king had aged, just a little more visibly. His beard was grayer, his eyes a touch heavier. They drank wine that wasn't too fine and shared bread that wasn't too stale. Ronan looked at him. "You're changing things," he said. Ulrich shrugged. "Trying." "You know what happens when kingdoms change too quickly?" "They fall?" Ronan nodded. "Or they get better, but only after they nearly fall." Ulrich took a sip. "Which one are we?" Ronan chuckled. "That, lad, is what we're about to find out." Autumn crept into the capital without ceremony. It arrived not with fanfare, but with a slow turning of leaves, a sharpening of the air, and the unmistakable scent of wood smoke curling through the city streets. The castle's stone walls, always a little cold, now pressed chill into the bones like an old memory returning uninvited. Inside, things were warming, politically at least. Ulrich sat at the end of a long table in a chamber known unironically as the Whispering Room. Its acoustics were flawless. Words spoken at one end traveled like secrets to the other. It was built for conspiracies, which made it the perfect place for what they were trying to do. Around him sat 7 individuals. Not nobles, not exactly. There was a merchant from the Eastern Trade Guilds, a senior sister from the Holy Assembly, a captain from the City Guard, even a quiet representative from the Stonemasons Guild, whose hands looked more capable of building barricades than shaking hands. Isabella had allowed this, encouraged it even. Not officially, of course. On parchment, this was a consultation. In practice, it was something very close to a shadow council. Ulrich cleared his throat. "We're not here to rewrite laws. We're here to examine them, to ask whether the way we've always done things still makes sense." "When has it ever made sense to tax goods coming into the city at 3 different gates and then again at the harbor?" The captain nodded. "My guards spend more time chasing smugglers than thieves." The sister raised a brow. "And if you remove the tax, then we lose revenue," Ulrich said, "unless we change where it goes and how it's spent." It was messy, slow, complicated. It was also working. Word of the meeting spread, not officially, but through the usual channels. Kitchen staff, stable hands, overenthusiastic scribes with loose lips and better ears. And as rumors go, it was one of the better ones. People began to talk, in taverns, in market stalls, even in the castle itself. "Lord Ulrich listens. Have you heard they're considering new trade paths? Maybe this kingdom won't be run entirely by cousins and cousins of cousins anymore." Of course, not everyone was pleased. The Duke of Heron was especially displeased. He voiced his concerns to Queen Isabella with the urgency of a man whose monocle was about to pop off. "He's undermining centuries of order," Heron insisted, "and doing it with peasants and priests." Isabella stirred her tea calmly. "He's discussing, not deciding. For now." She looked up. "Duke Heron, are you afraid of ideas?" "I am afraid of where those ideas may lead." "Then perhaps it is time to lead them somewhere useful." That silenced him, briefly. Later that evening, Isabella joined Ulrich in the garden. The air smelled like damp leaves and ambition. "Your council grows." "They're not a council." "Not yet." She sat beside him on a cold stone bench. "You've started something," she said. "And once something starts, it's very hard to put it back in the bottle." "Do you want to stop it?" "No," she said. "I want to steer it." They were silent a moment. "Ronan asked me the other night," Ulrich said, "if I knew what happens when a kingdom changes too quickly." "Ah," she said. "The king is in a philosophical mood again. He said it either falls or gets better." She nodded. "He's not wrong." "Which are we?" Isabella looked at him, and for once, there was no irony in her voice. "I think we're finally brave enough to find out." But far from the city, in the highlands where roads thinned and memories lingered, a different conversation was happening. Lord Hendril, that ancient fox, sat before his hearth, a glass of dark red wine in his hand and a messenger at his feet. "Ulrich's ideas are spreading," the messenger reported. Hendril chuckled. "Of course they are. People love the smell of change until it burns their house down." "Shall I respond to the Queen's summons?" "Not yet." He sipped his wine. "Let's see how long they dance before someone trips." Because while the city leaned toward reform, the rest of the kingdom watched from a distance. Some with hope, some with suspicion, and some with sharpened steel. The first thread arrived on parchment, not horseback. A simple letter. No seal, no name. Just a strip of rough fiber paper slipped under the Whispering Room's door in the dead of night, like a whisper carried on bad intentions. "A kingdom ruled by counsel is a kingdom ripe for carving." Ask the north what happens when too many hands reach for the reins. Ulrich found it at dawn, just before the first session of the day. He didn't mention it to the others. Not yet. Instead, he tucked it into his cloak and went on with the meeting, his voice steady, his posture sure, though his mind drifted. Later that morning, in the privacy of his quarters, he handed the note to Queen Isabella. She read it once, then again, then placed it beside the others. It was not the first. And? Ulrich asked. Her answer was dry. It's difficult to take a death threat seriously when it's written in poor calligraphy. He raised an eyebrow. So you're not concerned? Oh, I'm always concerned, she said, but I don't panic until the ink's in blood. Still, precautions were taken. Guards doubled. Messages coded, routes changed. And behind closed doors, the Queen and Ulrich met more frequently. No longer adversaries, but co-conspirators in a slow rebellion disguised as reform. But unrest does not always begin with swords. Sometimes it starts in markets. That week, prices for salt and wool surged across the city. Not dramatically, but enough. Enough that bakers complained, enough that tailors muttered, enough that someone somewhere was moving pieces across a very old, very dangerous board. The Merchant Guild denied involvement. The trade guilds shrugged. But Queen Isabella saw the pattern immediately. Sabotage by economy, she told Ulrich. Classic. From who? Someone who's run out of arguments. They met with the guildmaster that evening, a man who smelled of ink, old debt, and powdered orange peel. We need a freeze, Ulrich said. Hold prices, stabilize flow. The guildmaster laughed like someone sharpening a knife. This is not a stable season, my lord. Snow still clogs the northern passes, bandits nibble at supply lines. It's nature, not sabotage. Isabella leaned forward. Then nature is suddenly very precise. The guildmaster didn't blink. Then perhaps your majesty should speak with Lord Hendrel. Ulrich stiffened. Isabella smiled. So we've reached the naming phase. Hendrel, that old wolf. He hadn't appeared at court in months, but his handprints were everywhere, on letters unsigned, on merchants uncooperative, on rumors too slippery for truth but too persistent to ignore. He's testing you, Isabella said after the guildmaster left. Not for weakness, for resolve. Ulrich exhaled. Then let's answer him. They sent no message, no messenger, no threat. Instead, Ulrich stood in the castle square the following morning, flanked by guards and advisors and a single scribe with a flair for public declarations. He spoke not of Hendrel, not directly. He spoke of trade routes, of winter roads, of supporting the provinces with shared reserves. He spoke like a man in control, like a boy who had once run away and now knew exactly why he had returned. The people listened. More importantly, the merchants did too. That week, prices dropped, slightly, enough. And far away, in a snow-laced estate built on grudges and granite, Lord Hendrel set down his wine glass and said, "Well played." But games like these never ended with a single move. In the capital, Ronan watched from the margins. He no longer attended every council, no longer signed every decree. His health, never hearty, had begun to shift, subtly but surely. He moved slower, coughed more, slept longer. He did not complain, but he noticed, and so did Isabella. Late one night, she found him by the window, watching the wind stir dying leaves across the courtyard. Thinking of escaping, she asked gently. Always, he said. But the horses are slow, and the exits are guarded. She sat beside him. They didn't speak for a while. Then he said, "He's not you." "No," she agreed. "He doesn't command fear." "No, but he inspires something else." She looked at him. "Is that a problem?" He didn't answer. But the silence said, "Only if he's not ready." That winter, things shifted again. Slowly, subtly. The small council met twice with representatives from distant cities. A pilot program for regional emissaries was launched. Quietly, carefully. Ulrich's name began to appear in petitions, in prayers, in gossip. The listening lord was becoming something more. And somewhere deep beneath the castle, in a room older than memory and colder than any chamber above, a record keeper made a quiet note in the Book of Succession. Lord Ulrich considered. The Book of Succession was never meant to be read casually. Its pages, thick as coin and twice as heavy, were bound in dragonhide and chained to the stone pedestal where it had sat for over 2 centuries. Only 3 people had the authority to make entries. Only one of them still had steady hands. That person was Master Kale. Stooped, silent, and preserved almost entirely by ink fumes and ritual, Kale had served 5 monarchs, possibly 6, depending on how one counted the brief episode with the cousin regent. He made the note about Ulrich without ceremony. No flourish, no commentary, just considered. It was more than many ever got. Outside that cold sanctum, however, the city buzzed. Winter was loosening its grip, and with the thaw came new movement. Caravans returned to their routes. Boats chattered at the docks like gossiping gulls. In the streets, people walked faster, argued louder, and smiled just a little more, because the kingdom improbably still stood. Ulrich stood at the edge of the main hall, watching servants hang new banners above the grand staircase. They bore no crest, just the royal blue and silver, colors that belonged to no single house, but the realm itself. "They're beautiful," Sorel said beside him. "They're different." That's the idea. Isabella had approved the design herself, symbolic, neutral, dangerous in its own way, because it suggested that perhaps bloodlines weren't everything, because it dared to imagine a realm that could be unified by something other than lineage. Later that morning, Ulrich met with Queen Isabella in the Western Solarium, where the light cut through high windows and the air smelled faintly of lemon balm and caution. She handed him a document. He read it once, then again, then looked at her. "You want to name me heir?" "No," she said plainly. "I want to consider you. Publicly, let it be known that you are a candidate, a possibility." He stared. "That's enormous. It's strategic." She poured tea. "This kingdom has not named a successor while a monarch still lives in over 100 years. I know. And yet, here we are." He set the paper down. "Ronan is still king. Yes, and he will remain so, but the future can't wait for health reports." Ulrich hesitated. "This will cause an uproar." "Let it." She looked at him, voice softening. "You've done well, Ulrich, but now comes the part they never teach you." "What's that?" "Staying." The uproar came faster than expected. By nightfall, couriers had galloped in every direction with word of the Queen's declaration. It wasn't official, yet, but it didn't need to be. The realm heard one thing. Lord Alric might be next. In the north, Hendril threw a goblet at a fireplace and muttered something deeply unkind about paper crowns and blanket princes. In the east, 2 minor lords sent congratulatory letters, both containing subtle pleas for trade favors. In the city, reactions split. Some celebrated, some panicked, most watched, because the crown wasn't vacant. But for the first time, it was looking around the room. Ulrich lay awake that night. The halls outside his chamber were quiet, but not silent. Guards rotated, candles flickered. The city never truly slept. He thought of the boy who had fled these halls. He thought of the tower at Balamir, of speeches and snowfall and grain carts bearing another's mercy. He thought of the queen, offering possibility like a blade turned sideways, safe now but sharp forever. And he asked himself, quietly, what if I'm not ready? The question did not bring answers, only mourning. At breakfast, Ronan joined him unannounced. The king looked better than he had in weeks. He poured his own wine, a rare sign of either health or mild defiance. "So," Ronan said, sipping. "You're famous," Ulrich exhaled. "Apparently. They're sharpening knives in the south." "I noticed. And Hendril is gathering concerned lords." "Of course he is." Ronan chewed a piece of bread with the air of a man chewing decisions. "You don't have to accept," Ulrich looked up. "You think I shouldn't?" "I think," Ronan said slowly, "that you're about to find out the difference between being ready and being necessary." He stood. Most rulers never get to choose their moment. You may be the last who does. And with that, he left, leaving behind only crumbs, a half-empty goblet, and a future that no longer felt distant. The meeting was scheduled for dusk. By tradition, dusk meetings meant gravity, not urgency. That was reserved for meetings called during storms or over spilled blood, but seriousness, the kind of discussions that shifted maps and names. Queen Isabella had summoned 12, 6 lords, 3 counselors, 2 commanders, and Lord Ulrich. He arrived last deliberately, not to be dramatic, but because he was still weighing every possible outcome, and none of them were light. The chamber was lit with wall sconces, the flames casting long shadows across the mural of the founding of the realm, a scene where men who no longer had names stood shoulder to shoulder, pretending they'd never argued. Isabella stood at the head of the table, hands folded. She didn't sit. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "You know why you're here." That wasn't a question. She gestured to Ulrich. "Lord Ulrich is being considered for succession." One of the lords, a hawk-faced man named Sestrel, cleared his throat with the confidence of someone used to being agreed with. "This is premature," he said. "The king still reigns. There is no crisis." Isabella smiled thinly. The worst time to choose a successor is when you need one. Sestrel's frown deepened. But why him? Ulrich stepped forward. Because I'm not content with watching the realm run on habit. Another lord, more measured, leaned forward. Change is dangerous. Stagnation is lethal. Ulrich replied. The room quieted. Commander Thorne spoke next. If a claim is made, if it becomes public, others may feel emboldened. We've kept peace because succession has always been silent. Maybe silence isn't peace, Ulrich said. Maybe it's just delay. Eyes turned to Isabella. She nodded slowly. We are not announcing a coronation. We are acknowledging a possibility. That's all. And yet everyone in the room knew. Possibilities are seeds, and seeds grow. By the following week, the kingdom had effectively entered a new phase. Still no war, still no coronation, but no longer denial. Couriers carried scrolls marked draft decree, potential succession evaluation. It was the sort of phrasing only governments and overly cautious generals could invent. Carefully worded, technically nothing. Yet everyone understood it to mean, prepare. In Balamere, Baron Edron received a copy and laughed for 3 solid minutes. Incredible, he muttered. He hasn't even claimed the crown and they've already started writing the titles. Back in the capital, Ulrich walked with Isabella through the eastern gallery. It was lined with portraits of monarchs, some smug, some tired, all very dead. You realize what this does to the line, he said. She nodded. Of course. Others will challenge it. They should. He frowned. You want to fight? I want a worthy outcome. If your claim survives pressure, it was meant to. They stopped before one portrait, Queen Theliane the Unforgiving. Legend said she'd executed 5 dukes in 1 week. I don't want to be her, Ulrich said. You don't have to, Isabella replied. But you should thank her. Without her, the throne wouldn't have survived the plague. They moved on, past portraits, past history, into something still unwritten. Then came the feast. Not for celebration, Isabella was too calculated for that, but for visibility. It was her way of saying, we see the storm, we're still standing. Ulrich sat near the head of the table, not at it. A symbol again. Across from him sat Lady Vel, sharp-eyed and softer voiced than most expected. You're brave, she said between bites of roast duck. He raised a brow. For attending a feast? For standing still in front of moving knives. He chuckled. I'm not still, I'm just cornered. Well, she said, you make it look regal. They clinked goblets, the feast stretched into song, into wine, into whispered gossip masked by laughter. And all the while, eyes watched Ulrich, measuring him, testing his smiles for sincerity, waiting to see if the boy had grown teeth. Later that night, Ulrich found himself in the library. The feast had ended, but his mind hadn't. He stood before a map unrolled across a reading table. Not of kingdoms, of roads, trade, passage, communication. He traced his finger along one of the routes, Balamere to Thaldor, down through the riverlands. He didn't hear Isabella enter. You're studying maps, she said, trying to see what happens next. And every path crosses someone else's. She stepped beside him. This isn't a straight line, he said. It's a maze. And the moment I'm named, every other rat starts running, she finished. He looked at her. I'm not sure if that makes me the prize or the trap. Isabella smiled, maybe both. And with that, she left him to the map, the silence, and the knowledge that leadership wasn't earned just once. It had to be defended every single day. In the days that followed the feast, letters flowed through the capital like rain through gutters, unavoidable, occasionally rancid, and rarely addressed to the people actually affected. Most of them concerned Ulrich. Some praised, some protested, a few simply panicked. In the west, a minor baron declared his keep neutral territory and began charging tolls to anyone carrying scrolls with Ulrich's name on them. In the south, 2 petty lords signed an agreement vowing to oppose the reshaping of noble inheritance by committee, a document so filled with vague legalisms it could have doubled as a bedtime story for accountants. In the capital, Isabella did not flinch. She read each letter carefully, noted the authors, and then fed them to a small, iron-bellied brazier in her study, alongside orange peels, outdated tax charts, and a list of guests who had failed to bow properly at the feast. Ulrich, meanwhile, was restless. The slow pace of politics, so thick with ceremony and disclaimers, was like drowning in velvet. Every move felt delayed, softened by diplomacy, smothered in ritual. It was less like leading and more like shadow puppetry. He confided this one evening to Sorel, who listened patiently while sharpening a letter opener in the most unsettlingly casual way. "They're waiting for you to break," she said. He frowned. "Why would I do that?" "Because every heir does. The difference is whether you break quietly or loudly." That night, Ulrich didn't sleep. He walked the battlements again, pacing the same route he'd taken 100 times before. But this time, there was no snow, no silence, just the rumble of wind through open archways and the distant sound of the city breathing in its own uncertainty. In the east wing, a torch flared. A figure approached. It was Ronan, wearing a cloak too thin for the hour and the expression of a man who didn't care. "You know what's strange about ruling?" the king said, joining Ulrich at the wall. "Many things," Ulrich replied. Ronan nodded. "But here's one. You can win every argument, sign every law, survive every threat, and still feel like the walls are leaning in." Ulrich leaned on the stone, watching torchlight flicker along the rooftops. "Did you always feel that way?" "No," Ronan said. "Only after I stopped pretending I didn't." He turned to Ulrich. "She's serious about you, you know." Ulrich met his gaze. "Is that approval?" "It's warning," Ronan said. "You don't know what it costs her to say it aloud." They stood in silence. Then Ronan added, "There's talk of opposition." Ulrich didn't ask from whom. He already knew. The next day, confirmation arrived. Not in a letter, in a visitor. Lord Hendril. He entered the throne room unannounced, unhurried, and utterly unimpressed by the protocols that sprang up in his wake. Isabella greeted him with a smile that might have cracked glass. "Hendril?" she said. "I thought you'd send another letter." "I thought I'd deliver it in person," he said, handing her a scroll with the smugness of a man delivering a ransom note. Ulrich stood nearby, hands clasped. Hendril didn't look at him. "Your Highness," the old lord said, "with all due respect, the realm is not prepared for such a modern interpretation of succession." Isabella opened the scroll. It was a petition. Dozens of signatures, half the Western nobility. A line near the bottom: "We request a formal pause on the consideration of Lord Ulrich as successor until the full nobility may convene." It was written with the sort of politeness that demanded a war. Isabella handed it back. "Consider your protest received." "That's all?" She smiled. "Would you like a receipt?" Hendril narrowed his eyes. "You're dividing the kingdom." "No," she said calmly. "You're choosing to divide it." He finally turned to Ulrich. "You may speak well, boy, but if you crown a storm, don't be surprised when it rains." Ulrich stepped forward. "And if you crown silence, don't be surprised when no one hears you scream." Gasps. Isabella raised a hand, once sharp. "That's enough." Hendril bowed stiffly. "Then I'll see myself out." And he did. But the tension lingered, heavy and thick, like dust over old intentions. Later, in the Queen's study, Isabella poured wine with more force than usual. "He's making his move," she said. Ulrich took the goblet but didn't drink. "He has numbers." "He has nostalgia," Isabella corrected, "and the problem with nostalgia is that it forgets who paid for the past." She paced. "We need to act, swiftly." Ulrich nodded. "Then name me." She froze. "Now?" she said. "You said it yourself. If we wait, we surrender the narrative." She set the wine down. "If I do, you become a target." "I already am." A pause. Then, "You may not survive it." "Then I'll do what you did," he said. "I'll last long enough to matter." And with that, they understood each other, not as ruler and subject, not even as family, but as architects of something fragile, necessary, and very nearly impossible. It began with a bell, not a war bell, not yet, but one reserved for declarations, loud, singular, unmistakable. It rang across the capital, echoed through the markets, stirred pigeons from statues, and made children stop mid-mischief. It rang once, then silence. Then word spread. By decree of Queen Isabella, Lord Ulrich of House Valen was no longer merely under consideration. He was now named successor. Not heir apparent, not quite, but public, official, and unmistakable. The parchment was signed, sealed, and read aloud from the palace balcony by a herald who nearly choked on the final lines, aware of just how many lords might now want him dead by association. The city didn't riot. It whispered. It gasped. It recalculated. In the castle, Ulrich sat with the original decree in hand. His name, in the Queen's own hand, stared back at him like it was testing his resolve. Across the table, Isabella poured herself something stronger than tea. "We've crossed the line," she said. "No going back now?" She gave him a look. "Going back? My dear Lord Ulrich, I burned the map." The first response came within hours. A contingent of armored riders appeared at the northern gate, bearing the banner of Lord Hendrel. Their leader, a baron known for his mustache and poor impulse control, read a statement demanding the annulment of the decree on behalf of those who still respect the bloodlines of the realm. He was denied entry, firmly, but not violently, yet. Isabella, cool as ever, penned a reply, a public statement reminding all lords that the queen retained full legal right to name a successor of her choosing. But truth was rarely the problem. Ulrich met with the commanders of the city watch that afternoon. They discussed numbers, gates, armories. Should we prepare for a siege? One asked. Ulrich shook his head. Not yet. Hendrel's not foolish enough to attack the capital. Commander Thorn grunted. Fools don't start wars. Pride does. That evening, Ulrich stood on the castle balcony, the very one the herald had used that morning, and addressed a crowd. They weren't cheering, but they weren't throwing anything either. Progress. I did not ask for a crown, he said, but I will not walk away from it either. I will serve, if not all of you, then for all of you. He didn't promise peace. He didn't threaten war. He simply said, I am here. I am not hiding. And sometimes, presence is power. In a smoky tavern not far from the castle walls, a merchant leaned to a scribe and muttered, He speaks like he's already king. The scribe replied, Better that than another noble who only speaks to himself. In the west, Hendrel responded predictably, a formal protest, backed by 3 minor houses, and a letter addressed to the true defenders of the realm, calling for an assembly to review and challenge the appointment. It was less a letter and more a cannon shot, aimed not at the throne but the legitimacy beneath it. Isabella, reading the letter, snorted. They're forming a coalition. Ulrich stood beside her. Let them. She raised an eyebrow. If they gather, he said, they make themselves visible, and we show we are not afraid to speak, even to those who would silence us. Careful, she said. Conviction becomes arrogance quickly. He nodded, and silence becomes weakness quicker. Preparations began for what would later be called the Assembly of Icefall Hall, named after the fortress where Hendrel and his supporters agreed to meet. Officially, it was a noble conference. Unofficially, it was a challenge. Ulrich and Isabella would attend. Alone, they decided it would look like fear, but together it would look like authority. Sorel protested, of course. It's a trap, she said. Yes, Isabella replied, but if we don't walk into it, they get to build the rest of the trap wherever they please. As they rode out, escorted only by a handful of guards, they passed through the capital gates at dawn. No parade, no farewell, just a quiet city watching, wondering. And behind them in the distance, a bell tolled once again. Not for coronation, not for war, but for change. It began with a bell, not a war bell, not yet, but one reserved for declarations, loud, singular, unmistakable. It rang across the capital, echoed through the markets, stirred pigeons from statues and made children stop mid-mischief. It rang once, then silence, then word spread. By decree of Queen Isabella, Lord Ulrich of House Valen was no longer merely under consideration. He was now named successor. Not heir apparent, not quite, but public, official, unmistakable. The parchment was signed, sealed, and read aloud from the palace balcony by a herald who nearly choked on the final lines, aware of just how many lords might now want him dead by association. The city didn't riot. It whispered. It gasped. It recalculated. In the castle, Ulrich sat with the original decree in hand. His name, in the queen's own hand, stared back at him like it was testing his resolve. Across the table, Isabella poured herself something stronger than tea. We've crossed the line, she said. No going back now? She gave him a look. Going back? My dear Lord Ulrich, I burned the map. The first response came within hours. A contingent of armored riders appeared at the northern gate, bearing the banner of Lord Hendrel. Their leader, a baron known for his mustache and poor impulse control, read a statement demanding the annulment of the decree on behalf of those who still respect the bloodlines of the realm. He was denied entry, firmly, but not violently, yet. Isabella, cool as ever, penned a reply, a public statement reminding all lords that the queen retained full legal right to name a successor of her choosing. It was true, but truth was rarely the problem. Ulrich met with the commanders of the city watch that afternoon. They discussed numbers, gates, armories. Should we prepare for a siege, one asked. Ulrich shook his head. Not yet. Hendrel's not foolish enough to attack the capital. Commander Thorn grunted. Fools don't start wars. Pride does. That evening, Ulrich stood on the castle balcony, the very one the herald had used that morning, and addressed a crowd. They weren't cheering, but they weren't throwing anything either. Progress. I did not ask for a crown, he said, but I will not walk away from it either. I will serve, if not all of you, then for all of you. He didn't promise peace. He didn't threaten war. He simply said, I am here. I am not hiding. And sometimes presence is power. In a smoky tavern not far from the castle walls, a merchant leaned to a scribe and muttered, "He speaks like he's already king." The scribe replied, "Better that than another noble who only speaks to himself." In the west, Hendril responded predictably, a formal protest, backed by 3 minor houses, and a letter addressed to the true defenders of the realm, calling for an assembly to review and challenge the appointment. It was less a letter and more a cannon shot, aimed not at the throne but the legitimacy beneath it. Isabella, reading the letter, snorted, "They're forming a coalition." Ulrich stood beside her. "Let them." She raised an eyebrow. "If they gather," he said, "they make themselves visible, and we show we are not afraid to speak, even to those who would silence us." "Careful," she said. "Conviction becomes arrogance quickly." He nodded, "and silence becomes weakness quicker." Preparations began for what would later be called the Assembly of Icefall Hall, named after the fortress where Hendrel and his supporters agreed to meet. Officially, it was a noble conference. Unofficially, it was a challenge. Ulrich and Isabella would attend. Alone, they decided it would look like fear, but together it would look like authority. Sorel protested, of course. "It's a trap," she said. "Yes," Isabella replied, "but if we don't walk into it, they get to build the rest of the trap wherever they please." As they rode out, escorted only by a handful of guards, they passed through the capital gates at dawn. No parade, no farewell, just a quiet city watching, wondering. And behind them, in the distance, a bell tolled once again. Not for coronation, not for war, but for change. They rode back under gray skies. No victory parade, no trumpets, just the clatter of hooves on wet stone and the quiet that follows when something heavy has shifted beneath your feet. Icefall Hall faded behind them, becoming just another silhouette in the mist. Less a place, more a memory of what it almost became. Ulrich didn't speak for most of the journey. Neither did Isabella. Words would come later. For now, they rode with the knowledge that the assembly had not broken, but it had bent. Enough to matter. Enough to begin. By the time they returned to the capital, the whispers had become murmurs, and the murmurs were now conversations. Ulrich had faced the lords. Ulrich had survived an assassin. Ulrich had not bowed. And perhaps most importantly, Isabella had not blinked. That evening, as the city's lamps flickered to life, Queen Isabella stood before the High Court and did something she'd never done in 20 years of rule. She stepped back, just half a step, and said, "Lord Ulrich will speak." It was not abdication. It was acknowledgement, and it echoed louder than any coronation bell. Ulrich addressed the court with steady breath and unshaking hands. "We live in a kingdom afraid of mirrors," he began, "afraid to look and see that the world has changed while we stood still." He didn't attack, he didn't beg, he spoke like a man who had nothing to prove but everything to offer. There is a difference between tradition and memory. One guides, the other clings. I ask you, which one are we following? When he finished, even those who despised him remained silent, because silence sometimes is respect too. That week, Queen Isabella called a formal council. It was her final move in a game most didn't realize had already been won. She placed before them 2 sealed documents. One was her own decree, the other, her will. Ronan, now resting more than ruling, gave his blessing without hesitation. "If the realm is to move forward," he said from his chambers, voice thin but clear, "then let it do so with eyes open." The council voted. Unanimously, Lord Ulrich was named Crown Regent, effective immediately. In the capital, bells rang. Again, but this time they rang with clarity. No confusion, no doubt. Just a single message. Prepare. Ulrich was not king, not yet. But the road was his now, and behind him the queen finally exhaled. That night, in the royal gardens, Isabella found Ulrich seated on the same bench they'd shared months earlier, before declarations, before assassins, before maps were rewritten. "Is it strange," she asked, "that I feel relieved?" He looked at her. "You've held the crown a long time." "Too long, long enough to shape it." They sat in the dark, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves and the distant crackle of torches. You'll do well, she said. I'll try. Don't, he blinked. She turned to him. Trying is for people with exits. You've chosen this, so don't try. Do. He nodded. I will. In the weeks that followed, the kingdom adjusted slowly, deliberately, but willingly. Documents were updated, emissaries were summoned, and for the first time in decades, the palace doors opened not just for nobles, but for voices that had never been allowed beyond the walls. The listening lord had become something more. And the queen, she remained. Not as shadow, but as steel behind the curtain. But in the far north, where snow still ruled and memory ran deep, a new letter was written, unmarked, unsealed, and bearing only 4 words, the game begins now. It would not reach the capital for another fortnight, and by then the frost would have teeth. Danyan, Dela Noidung Bandadua. Spring crept through the capital as subtly as a rumor, green tendrils coaxing life from stone, the scent of damp earth drifting through open windows, and birds returning like hopeful messengers. The city awakened cautiously, as if unsure whether the thaw signified hope or another deception disguised as a beginning. In the palace, the atmosphere shifted too. Mornings began with real voices, not just lords, but commoners, merchants, scholars, slipping through the carved doors of the council chamber. The restored courtyards hummed with life, footfalls echoing off polished marble, replacing the stale hush of centuries-old consensus with something more vibrant, more deliberate. Ulrich presided, regent robes rustling softly as he seated himself behind a familiar desk now lined with petitions shaped by every corner of the realm. He read them still, listened still, acted swiftly. But now, his actions carried the weight of yet-to-be-crowned authority, a living bridge between what had been and what would come. Across the hall, Queen Isabella watched. She didn't stand at Ulrich's elbow. She walked beside him. In the solarium, they discussed reports of failing crops in the east and unrest in the borderlands. In the war room, they scrutinized troop placements and supply lines. Quietly, she offered counsel. Keenly, he asked for it, even when his jaw tightened to hide that he needed her. Together, they were something neither had been alone. But beyond the city's edge, in the eastern farmlands, spring wasn't so forgiving. Fields that had promised renewal lay muddy and frosted at night. Farmers whispered of the frost that shouldn't have and said it like a prayer against ruin. Markets began reporting shortages of grain, of cattle, of hope. Ulrich heard the whispers, not last week, not yesterday. Just as spring broke, the frost returned, marked, deliberate, devastating. He convened midday. The council sat, fanned out across benches, some cast in iron, others plain wood, but all occupied. He spoke simply, "We've lost half the eastern harvest. If this continues, half the realm may starve." Murmurs rose until silenced by gravity in his voice. How do we fix it? Debate followed. Aid routes, price freezes, seed reserves, migration subsidies. A petition formed, state assistance for farmers. Good, heard, recorded, processed, but Ulrich paused. He stood. "I want every councilman to ride east with me," he said. "Today," murmurs returned, allies and skeptics alike. It was bold. Then Isabella smiled. "Lead by example." The council wavered, then nodded, and so they mounted. They rode through farmland coated in green and brown, punctuated by uprooted stalks and hobbling livestock. Ulrich walked field rows with a farmer named Marta, a woman whose hands told stories of years in labor. He knelt, felt the soil, asked questions. Marta answered, bluntly. "They blame the crown," she said, "for listening too late, for promises delayed." He stood and offered gratitude. Not a speech, not a scroll. A promise. We'll be back with action, not apologies. The South, the West, regional governors watched on message relays. By the next morning, carts of seed, grain, blankets, medicines rolled east, led by Crown Regent's banner. That evening, Ulrich and Isabella returned to the palace through narrow city streets, unannounced, unparaded, just 2 figures side by side. "At least it wasn't a banquet," Ulrich said dryly. She leaned against a lantern post, smoke curling around her head like a halo. "It was better," she said. "It was honesty," he sighed. "We're almost there. Almost," she corrected. "But now comes the test." He looked at her. Steady. Silent. They didn't explain. They didn't need to. They just knew. Days later, word arrived from Icefall Hall. Lord Hendrill's coalition had unraveled. Minor lords withdrew. The northern barons demanded better terms. One by one, the protests melted like snow gone wild. In the capital, the council reconvened. This time, they passed the petition. Public assistance funded, roads repaired, seed distributed, farms preparing again. Ulrich made no announcement. He merely watched as the councilmen voted, some with relief, others with resignation. Then they did something more. They thanked him, some quietly, some with public bows, but all with the weight of acknowledgement. And that evening, for the first time, the palace felt truly open. Emissaries spoke in hallways, apprentices carried petitions, and in the grand hall, Ulrich and Isabella sat at either end of a long table, no thrones, only seats, surrounded by a mix of heads of state, guildmasters, and regional representatives. They broke bread, they discussed laws, they charted borders together. In the northern highlands, a figure watched from a ridge, hooded, still distant, still plotting. The game wasn't over, but the kingdom had found momentum, and that's often enough. Danyan, de la Noidung Ban Dadua. Summer arrived with a promise this time. No brittle frost whispering threats in the night, but a steady warmth that seeped into every corner of the capital. The city's blossoms opened fully, market stalls bristled with produce, and for once, hope smelled like fresh-baked bread rather than ash. Inside the castle, the hum of life had become purposeful harmony. Ulrich, now in his second month as crown regent, no longer felt like a visitor in corridors once haunted by his youth. He moved through halls with authority in his posture, though never arrogance. He greeted petitioners by name and remembered the crops in the east. He walked beside the queen, no longer trailing her in shadow. Together they carried the rhythm of governance. But summer brings scrutiny as well as warmth. An envoy from the Southern Isles had arrived bearing an unusual request, permission to establish a university of natural philosophy. Not theology, not law, but science. Knowledge derived from observation and experimentation. A challenge to tradition, which had, until now, placed the divine word above the earthly. Isabella read their petition aloud before the council, her voice calm as ever. They propose a place of learning that observes the world rather than interprets it. She paused, then looked to Ulrich. What do you think? He paused. It was the sort of proposal that could split realms, innovation or rebellion. This kingdom needs curiosity more than caution, he said. Let knowledge grow, under watchful eyes, of course. The council murmured, some frowned, others straightened, but after discussion the petition passed. The southern envoy bowed deeply. Thank you, Regent. And outside, word traveled. A school of thought had been planted in the kingdom's soil, but change always attracts resistance. A messenger arrived at midnight, a note, no signature, left in Ulrich's chambers. We observe. We need not comment yet, but let this be known. You are watched. He showed it to Isabella, who poured them both a glass of wine and regarded him with steady eyes. They didn't protest the university, she said. Not yet. He sampled the wine. Neither did Hendril. He's getting quiet. That's good, she said. Or dangerous. They didn't sleep well that night. Over the following days, Ulrich took steps to reinforce the kingdom's safety. Not by filling dungeons, but by building trust. He visited the northern border posts, greeted watchmen, shared rations, listened to stories. He promised that the kingdom would defend them, not just tax them. He spent the night under canvas, next to soldiers eating hard bread and telling darker tales of bandit activity. Back in the capital, Isabella established a secret academy within the palace, an informal circle of scholars and advisors studying law, agriculture, astronomy. Not public yet, but a seed, nonetheless. Then came the festival of midsummer, a celebration to remind everyone of unity. Markets, songs, dancing in the streets, a procession led by Crown Regent and Queen together. It was no spectacle, but a statement. In the great square, Ulrich addressed the crowd. In summer's light, let us remember that growth comes from reaching into the warm air, but a root must still grasp the earth. People cheered, some cried, horses neighed, children laughed. Beyond the crowd, among the banners, watchful eyes noted. They saw strength without threat. That night, after the festival, Ulrich and Isabella walked through the gardens once more. Lanterns glowed like fireflies, the air smelled of rose and cooled earth. He turned to her. Our roots are deepening, she nodded. But so is the depth around them. He looked at her. What worries you? Not what's in the palace, she said, but outside. A root only grows as well as the soil allows. They didn't elaborate. In the weeks after summer's festival, small rebellions ignited, not from nobles but common folk. A village in the west refused to pay inland tariffs. A riverfolk community demanded representation in trade. Merchants in the south whispered of favoritism. Ulrich dispatched envoys. not knights, not soldiers, clear-eyed negotiators with blank parchment and open ears. In 1 week, complaints became agreements. Tensions eased. A pattern emerged. When voices were heard, rebellion didn't have to burn. Still, the Watchers remained. One afternoon, while Ulrich studied a map in the solarium, Isabella entered quietly. A folded note lay beside him. He read, "You speak for the people, but keep an eye on the queen. A crown can blind." Isabella watched him. He folded the note and tucked it away. "You're the cautious one tonight." She smiled gently. "Not cautious. Careful." He nodded. "Together? Always." That evening, in a private meeting with the High Council, decisions were made to expand representation. Seats for trade guilds, clergy, new seats for frontier governors. A blueprint for a more permanent assembly began to take shape. It was fragile. It was bold. It was new. Outside, in the northern highlands, the hooded figure reappeared, watching the capital through spyglass glass, distant and still, plotting. Their lips curved ever so slightly upward. Because as summer deepens, so does the map of threats, and with each new route of progress, there comes another twist of the soil. Danyan. De la Noidung Bandadua. The late summer sun cast long, golden rays through the palace windows, painting the council chamber in warm hues, an illusion of peace perhaps, but one fitting for the moment. Outside, the city hummed with life. Children chased dogs along cobblestones, merchants shouted deals, and gardeners in the royal grounds whispered care into swelling flower beds. Yet inside, atmosphere was measured, deliberate. Ulrich presided at the head of a longer table than ever before. Its length wasn't for grandeur, it signified inclusion. Seated were the new assembly members, counselors from guilds, envoys from border farms, and even a humble schoolmaster who'd shepherded the new academy's earliest discussions. Isabella stood at his side, silent strength in a world often tired of change. "Let us begin," Ulrich said. His voice carried only the weight of purpose. He read briefly from summer harvest reports. Grain yields were improving, trade was steady, and the University of Natural Philosophy was scheduled to open its first classroom in the autumn. But optimism did not mask concern. He paused, eyes scanning every face. "We have progress," he continued, "but also warnings. Word has reached the east. The frost damage healed too quickly. Some say that magic, or misuse of knowledge, accelerated the thaw. Others whisper that enchantments masked losses." A ripple of tension passed through the room. The schoolmaster nodded quietly, clearing his throat. "My students are studying weather patterns. We have data. No incantations, only charts." His voice trembled not from fear, but pride. A representative from the border farms, a woman named Frila, looked doubtful. "We welcome new ideas, Regent, but if fields fail again, we cannot trust charts while our children go hungry." Ulrich listened. "We will share data openly, if trust is earned, not assumed." He paused to meet Isabella's gaze. "Then we must show, not tell." Agreement echoed around the table. Notes were taken, questions answered, representation mattered, but so did clarity. Still, the Watchers remained. Late that night, Ulrich walked alone through the Supreme Library, a place of both wisdom and old danger. He found their note tucked between volumes. "Speak clearly, Regent, or the Queen will speak for you." His stomach tightened. He looked to the moonlit window, away from shadows. Then he began sorting through old court records, gaps, inconsistencies. He stayed until dawn, forging through centuries of precedent for clarity and legality in equal measure. When Isabella joined him before ceremony, she found him standing over open books. He looked up, weary. "You stayed late again," she said softly. He shrugged. "We build from truth. Truth takes time." She nodded. "And scrutiny." He closed a dusty ledger. "Yes, I will speak clearly." They crossed the library, their footsteps echoing, but softer now, practiced. Morning brought greater focus. A delegation arrived from the city of Riverport, a bustling hub at the river's mouth. They came with concerns. Rising import tariffs had slowed local trade, and foreign merchants mulled detours through Pontacross and neighboring lands. Their representative, a merchant prince named Garrison, spoke under oath to the new assembly. "We build this union to support each other," he said, "not burden those at the gateways." He proposed tariff adjustments tied to cargo value. Ulrich listened, then granted permission to study and report within a fortnight. Garrison bowed. Isabella observed quietly. She asked the first follow-up question. "Will this hurt coffers?" The representative nodded. She nodded back. "Then we adjust elsewhere." It was a partnership. ambition balanced with reality. Meanwhile, in the depths of the Northern Highlands, the hooded observer remained unreadable. Their presence was less shadow now, but a reminder that watchful eyes extended far beyond borders and assemblies. They moved slowly, jotting in a slim journal and disappearing into the bray as quickly as they'd come. Many wondered who they might be. A messenger? A foreign agent? Perhaps a remnant of old regimes unwilling to vanish. Ulrich didn't guess. Back at the palace, an evening banquet was held, not in the grand hall, but in the solarium, where moonlight filtered through fragrant leaves. Candles glowed between olive trees, and the air smelled of jasmine and fresh-baked bread. Invitations went to those who had helped: the schoolmaster, the farmer, Riverport's merchant, emissaries from the university. It was modest, symbolic. Ulrich stood to address them. This gathering is not a celebration of achievement, but of responsibility. A reminder that progress is neither recorded nor remembered by those who hold highest titles, but by the ones whose lives change. The schoolmaster raised a glass. To building together. All joined him. Glasses tinkled softly, echoing in warm night air. But threats lingered. That same night, Isabella received a visitor via secret door, the Duchess Marival, face drawn but determined. "He writes," she said, handing over a sealed scroll. Aligned with Hendrill's faction, the letter demanded the tariff inquiry occur under a retribution clause. Any findings deemed unflattering to nobility must be suppressed. Isabella's lips hardened. She stared at Ulrich across the candlelight. He recognized the look. He took the scroll. "Are they testing the limit or building a wall?" she replied. He opened it, scanned the decree. "Not going to happen," he said calmly. "We report, and if it offends, so be it." She nodded, relief thin. "And they'll call you radical." He smiled gently. "Then I'll be a radical they can't ignore." Autumn approached. Leaves shifted from green to gold, paths hardened for harvest, university plans progressed, and threads of scrutiny tightened. But for the first time, it wasn't just voices in the dark. It was voices in the open. A kingdom was waking, quiet, determined, aware. In the solarium's fragrant stillness, Ulrich and Isabella stood side by side. She touched his arm. "Summer ends soon." He looked at her. "So must we grow more," she nodded, "and trust." They looked out at lamps flickering in the dusk. Roots took time, but they could take hold. Danyan. De la Neudung Bandadua. Autumn's arrival solidified the shift. Leaves fell in ribbons of crimson and gold, carpeting the courtyards with color. A chill, less biting now, more thoughtful, lingered in the morning air. The palace felt different. The corridors no longer echoed with hesitant footsteps, but with purpose. Decisions were being made. Ulrich rose early, as was his habit. He walked to the solarium, where amber leaves filtered the light, and found Isabella already there. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the day dawn. "Autumn's promise," she said softly. He nodded. Change rooted. They sat at the small table, bathlit by crisp morning sun, and reviewed the agenda for the day. The central item, the first public report on the University of Natural Philosophy's founding and initial council proceedings. Never before had a report been delivered, a public address included in the official calendar. The hall filled later in the day with townsfolk, scholars, artisans, and a few curious nobles. The tone was informal, yet earnest. Ulrich spoke first. "In spring, I asked for curiosity. Now I ask for patience. The university stands on promise, not prestige. It will take time, but the kingdom will stand by it." Scholars nodded, some applauded, merchants murmured approval. A few nobles, seated stiffly at the back, did not clap. That was okay. With openness, not everyone applauds. Next came the farmers. A messenger from the Eastern Plains presented harvest production statistics, showing recovery and modest growth. Ulrich interpreted the data for the crowd. "This is your work. This is what governance should support. You." The crowd cheered. Deep in the back, a man whispered, "Look how far we've come." Ulrich smiled slightly, but as they departed, a messenger handed him a folded parchment. It bore only a single phrase, "Under watch." He read it quickly and tucked it into his robe. Not now, he decided. Not until evening. That night in the library, he found Isabella reviewing state plans for winter aid. Candlelight flickered off pages marked with routes, storage locations, and distribution teams. "They've noticed," she said, without looking up. He folded the note and set it on the desk. "Yes." She studied the winter plans. "People will need more." He swallowed. "We have more. We just need faith." She looked at him with concern. "And resolve." They worked into the early hours. More maps, more numbers, more promises. Exhaustion came, but intention held stronger. The following morning, a crimson banner flew above the southern gate. Lord Hendrill's standard. It had arrived by dawn. His envoy delivered a single message: winter meet at Borderhold. We discussed these changes strictly. It was both invitation and warning. Ulrich read it in the council chamber as the assembly watched. "That's formal," he said. Isabella spoke next. "They choose to convene under their terms. We can oblige." A pause. Ulrich looked around the room. "We go. They will meet us on their turf," Isabella noted. "Careful." He nodded, but not afraid. And so, Crown Regent and Queen prepared to leave the capital again. That evening, they rode south under moonlight. Their party was modest, 10 guards and 2 scribes. No fanfare, no indication of fear. Some called it meek, he called it measured. As dawn broke, they arrived at Borderhold, a stern stone fortress carved beneath cliffs. Icicles dripped like silent watches, banners snapped overhead. It was colder here, but not just from the air. Inside, lords in fur-lined cloaks awaited. They circled a fire in the courtyard, where smoke drifted like unspoken warnings. No chairs had been laid out. Conversation would be standing. Ulrich and Isabella dismounted. The guards stood down, no tension, no challenge. They approached the fire. The lords watched. One barked, "Your Gracies." They nodded halfway. A hush followed. A northern baron stood. "You journey here to meet our terms?" "I did," Ulrich said, "to listen." A brief pause. The snowy ground crunched beneath shifts of boots. A noblewoman spoke next. "We demand clarity on the university funding and winter relief plans." "Agreed," Ulrich said. "Let us present." Isabella gestured to the scribes who unfurled maps and ledgers across a makeshift table. Candlelight and lantern glow illuminated numbers, supply routes, budgets, emergency stores. Ulrich explained, "This is what the university will cost this year, and these are the stores I've approved for distribution, region by region." A murmur among the lords. Another baron nodded. "These provisions cross our lands." He looked to Ulrich. "And that's wise." Ulrich met Isabella's gaze. She stood silent, ally. Discussion turned into questioning. "Why not fund the university through new taxes?" asked one. "Because knowledge isn't a luxury," Ulrich replied. "It's utility." "Why reroute grain through Halshar?" another asked. "Because traders need incentive to carry aid," Isabella said. "With clear purpose, they will." The night grew deeper. Lances of discussion turned blunt. Queries about representation, military funding, winter forecasts. Each was addressed with candor and fact. Moon rose. The fire softened. No shouting, no threats, just clarity. At last, the first baron spoke again. "You answer truths I feared to ask. That matters." More nodded. Silence settled, not uneasy, but deliberate. Before dawn, notes were drafted, a letter of recognition for the Winter Relief Initiative and amendments to university funding. Greater contribution from trade duties, not taxes. Borderhold's lords would oversee distribution. Signed by both Queen and Regent, the document was handed to Lord Hendrill as resolution, not defeat, but agreement. A hushed acknowledgement passed among the lords. One raised a mug. "To understanding." Another echoed, "To survival." Ulrich and Isabella inclined their heads. They departed Borderhold at first light, snow light on their cloaks. No one saluted them as they rode away, not out of disrespect, but because respect had become working trust. As the fortress faded behind, they spoke quietly. "Did we win?" Ulrich asked. "We answered," Isabella said. "That is often winning," he exhaled. "So we grow again." She smiled, carefully. Back in the capital, winter set in. Snow fell soft and certain, but there were no shortages. Relief carts moved smoothly. The university opened a small lecture hall. Citizens murmured appreciation, spoke of hope, not loss. In the solarium, Ulrich and Isabella watched the first winter snowfall through frost-lined windows. He turned to her. "Rooted?" She nodded. "Grounded?" He smiled. "We'll need both." She placed a hand on his arm. "Always together." Stop danyan. Winter deepened, soft snow blanketing the capital, muffling sound but not action. The city's heartbeat shifted. Quiet footfalls on white stone, doorways lined with firewood, smoke curling from every rooftop chimney. The autumn roots had thawed the ground, but now the frost tested their strength. In the palace, the rhythm of governance continued undaunted. Ulrich awoke early and walked through the spacious corridors to the council chamber, where he joined Isabella already seated at the head of a long table. The morning light through frosted windows made crystal patterns on the stone floor. reminders that even the cold beauty of winter could be fragile, sharp, and ephemeral. Today's agenda: integrating the university into the palace's central administration, winter relief updates, and planning for the upcoming Festival of New Light, a ceremony to mark renewal in the midst of cold. The session began with the High Chancellor presenting the university's status. "Enrollment is modest but respectable," he said. "We have 10 apprentices studying natural philosophy, 12 studying law, and 5 looking into agricultural improvements." His voice echoed in the chamber with authoritative calm. Ulrich nodded thoughtfully. Progress builds slowly, but each student can multiply knowledge beyond these walls. Next came the head of winter relief. All regions have received their first shipments. Feedback indicates that supplies lasted 2 weeks longer than last year. Isabella interjected, "And we have extra reserves in case of further frost." A few ministers shifted uneasily. One murmured, "The realm's granaries are still under capacity." Ulrich raised a hand for silence. "These are not failures, only steps toward readiness. We adjust." He glanced at Isabella and then to the group. "Our plan remains dynamic. We remain honest." A hush fell. Assembly took note of his measured authority. Later that morning, Ulrich left the castle. He walked through the city unannounced, cloaked and chosen guards at distance. Markets bustled, pungent bread loaves sold warm, wool merchants counted flocks' yields, quills scratched over simple petitions. He exchanged nods, brief greetings. No fanfare, just presence. In a sunlit square, he paused to speak with Marta, the farmer from the east. She recognized him, smiled gratefully. They spoke quietly. "The frost took some of my seed this year," she said, "but renewals came early." He thanked her, promised continued support. No proclamation, no scrolls, just acknowledgement. That evening in the solarium, Ulrich and Isabella reviewed festival plans. Lanterns would be strung between olive trees, songs sung, dances performed, goodwill shared. But winter's tale would not be dismissed lightly, a moment of resilience before spring. Isabella said, "It'll matter more than ever this year." He nodded. "Our roots hold steady." She rested her hand on his, "and they'll reach deeper still." Festival night arrived amid clear skies and crisp stars. The solarium filled with scholars and farmers, merchants and knights, new assembly members and palace staff. Music rose, harps, flutes, voices, while food roasted, stallions stamped, lantern smoke spiraled upward. Ulrich stood with Isabella as they lit the first lantern, their combined hands striking a match. "May light and learning guide us through darkness," Ulrich said, voice ringing clear. Isabella watched the flame catch, smiled. They made their rounds. Children darted through candlelit columns. Elders shared stories by fire pits, wine cups offered and received carefully. Opposition lords were present, watching thoughtfully. This was not a show, it was a demonstration of shared warmth. Later, as music softened, an unexpected guest appeared. The merchant prince Garrison from Riverport. He approached Ulrich, eyes gleaming. "I brought salt from the new mine," he said quietly. "It's ours to offer, freely." Ulrich accepted the salt, symbolic and simple, a gift from a realm extending beyond borders. The crowd thinned, the music softened further, and the queen joined Ulrich at the edge of the square. "You did well tonight," she said. "We did," he corrected. She studied him. "You speak quietly, but your words are heard." He smiled softly. "We build trust by listening." She kissed his cheek. "And now, by sharing flame." The next morning, heralds announced the university's first full lecture series, Winter Relief's second distribution, and the appointment of a new Council of Renewal. 20 members from across the kingdom, tasked with overseeing an annual review of harvests, climate, and governance. It would meet each autumn. Ulrich reviewed the notice with Isabella. "They told me you were radical," he said. "They were mistaken," she replied. "You're rooted." A messenger arrived before the first council session could begin. He handed Ulrich a scroll, sealed in black wax. Inside, one phrase, "Roots unseen grow the deepest." No name, no threat, just a reminder. Ulrich looked to Isabella. She gave him an encouraging nod. He set the scroll on a marble ledge. "Let them grow," he whispered. "Deep." She raised her glass. "To roots." Ulrich joined her. And in that quiet evening, beneath frost-touched columns and gathering night, their journey of light and listening found its truest glow. The end. Thank you for following this story to its final chapter. And there it is, our story, rooted in frost and fire, finally at rest beneath winter's quiet snow. If you made it this far, thank you. Truly. Whether you listened every night or just arrived near the end, you've helped breathe life into this tale. So now I have a question. What stayed with you? Was it the flicker of lanterns in the solarium, the echo of Queen Isabella's quiet strength, Ulrich's journey from listener to leader, or perhaps a single line, a silent moment, a whispered thought? I'd love to know. Leave a comment below. Seriously, I read every one. Hearing your reflections makes the hours of writing worth it. And if you found comfort, curiosity, or even just a moment of peace in this story, consider subscribing to the channel. It helps me keep telling stories like these, gentle, thoughtful, maybe even a little magical. Until the next tale arrives, may your nights be warm, your roots deep, and your stories ever growing. Sleep well, time traveler, and I'll see you in the next chapter.